Hi, Anime Fanatic. Hey, Casey. Hi, Spyro. Welcome to the stream. I hope you're all doing well today. Eesh! Today, we are continuing our voyage with Captain Nemo and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Yay! There was something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten it. Hooray! So let's just groovy on in, shall we? Alright. Hi, Casey! Oh, how's audio, by the way? Can you hear the music alright, is basically what I'm asking. And me. Oh, how is it going? How are you all? I hope you're all doing well. Audio's good? Okay. Groovy oovy. Alright. Should I recall where we last left off correctly? We just learnt about the fate of an explorer and what happened to him. That Captain Nemo learnt the rest of it, that the world did not, beyond did not know. I'm good, just getting home from work 12 hours later. Oh, wow. I hope you get some good rest, Casey. That sounds rough. Alright. Chapter 20. The Torres Strait. During the night of December 27th to 28th, the Nautilus left the waterways of Vanikoro behind with extraordinary speed. Its heading was southwesterly, and in 3 days it had cleared the 750 leagues that separated La Poroses Islands from the southeastern tip of Papua. On January 1st, 1868, bright and early, Council joined me on the platform. "Will the master," the gallant lad said to me, "allow me to make him a happy new year? To wish him a happy new year?" Good heavens, Council, it's just like old times in my office at the Botanical Gardens in Paris. I accept your kind wishes and I thank you for them. Only, I'd like to know what you mean by a happy year under the circumstances in which we're placed. It is a year that will bring our imprisonment to an end, or a year that will see this strange voyage continue. Ye gods, Council replied. I hardly know what to tell, Master. We're certainly seeing some unusual things, and for 2 months we've had no time for boredom. The latest wonder is always the most astonishing, and if this progression keeps up, I can't imagine what its climax will be. In my opinion, I'll never again have such an opportunity. Never, Council. Besides, Mr. Nemo really lives up to his Latin name, since he couldn't be less in the way of he didn't exist. True enough, Council. Therefore, with all due respect to Master, I think a happy year would be a year that lets us see everything. Everything, Council. No year could be that long. But what does Ned Land think about all of this? Ned Land's thoughts are exactly the opposite of mine, Council replied. He has a practical mind and a demanding stomach. He's tired of staring at fish and eating them day in and day out. This shortage of wine, bread, and meat isn't suitable for an upstanding Anglo-Saxon man. A man accustomed to beefsteak and unfazed by regular doses of brandy or gin. In part, Council, that doesn't bother me in the least, and I've adjusted very nicely to the diet on board. So have I, Council replied. Accordingly, I think as much about saying as Mr. Land about making his escape. Thus, if this new year isn't as a happy one for me, it will be for him, and vice versa. No matter what happens, one of us will be pleased. So in conclusion, I wish Master to have whatever his heart desires. Thank you, Council. Only I must ask you to postpone the question of New Year's gifts, and temporarily accept a hearty handshake in their place. That's all I have on me. Master has never been more generous, Council replied. And with that, the gallant lad went away. By January 2nd, we had fared 11,340 miles, hence 5,250 leagues from our starting point in the seas of Japan. Before the Nautilus spurred there stretched the dangerous waterways of the Coral Sea off the northeast coast of Australia. Our boat cruised along a few miles away from that daunting shoal where Captain Cook's ships well nigh miscarried on June 10th, 1770. The craft that Cook was aboard charged into some coral rock, and if his vessel didn't go down, it was thanks to the circumstances that a piece of coral broke off in the collision and plugged the very hole it had made in the hull. I would have been deeply interested in visiting this long, 360-league reef, against which the ever-surging sea broke with the fearsome intensity of thunderclaps. But just then, the Nautilus' slanting fins took us to great depths, and I could see nothing of those high coral walls. I had to rest content with the various specimens of fish brought up by our nets. Among others, I noted some long-finned albacore, a species in the genus Succomber, as big as tuna, bluish on the flanks and streaked with cross-wire stripes that disappeared when the animal dies. These fish followed us in schools and supplied our table with very dainty flesh. We also caught a large number of yellow-green gilt heads, half a decimeter long and tasting like dorado, plus some flying gurnards, authentic underwater shallows that, on dark nights, alternately streak air and water with their phosphorescent glimmers. Among mollusks and zoophytes, I found in our trawls meshes various species of Alcyorean coral, sea urchins, hammer shells, spur star shells, Wentle-trap snails, horn shells, glass snails. The local flora was represented by fine floating algae, sea tangle, and kelp from the genus Macrocetus, saturated with the mucilage of their pores perspire, from which I selected a wonderful Nemostoma geniarodia, classifying it with the natural curiosities in the museum. On January 4th, 2 days after crossing the Coral Sea, we raised the coast of Papua. In this occasion, Captain Nemo told me that he intended to reach the Indian Ocean via the Torres Strait. This was the extent of his remarks. Ned saw with pleasure that this course would bring us once again closer to European seas. The Torres Strait is regarded as no less dangerous for its bristling reefs than for the savage inhabitants of its coasts. It separates Queensland from the huge island of Papua, also called New Guinea. Papua is 400 leagues long by 130 leagues wide, with a surface area of 40,000 geographic leagues. It's located between longitude 0 degrees 19 and 10 degrees 2 south, and between longitude 128 degrees 36 and 146 degrees 15. At noon, when the chief officer was taking the sun's altitude, I spotted the summits of the Afrak Mountains, rising in terraces and ending in sharp peaks. Discovered in 1511 by the Portuguese Francesco Serrano, these shores were successfully visited by Don Jorge de Menes in 1526, by John de Girjalva in 1527, by the Spanish general Alvaro de Saavedra in 1528, by Indigo Orchitz in 1545, by the Dutchman Straltzen in 1616, by Nicholas Struik in 1753, by Tansman, Dampier, Flamel, Carteret, Edwards, Bougainville, Cook, McClure, and Thomas Florist, by Rear Admiral de Entrecastil in 1792, by Louis Isidore Duperrey in 1823, and by Captain Dumont d'Urville in 1827. It's the heartland of the blacks who occupy all Malaysia, Mr. de Renzi had said. I hadn't the foggiest inkling what sailor's luck was about to bring me face to face with these daunting Adaman Aborigines. I'm struggling a lot today. Oh dear. I apologize. So the Nautilus hove before the entrance to the world's most dangerous strait, a passageway that even the boldest navigators hesitated to clear. The strait that Luis Vers de Torres faced on returning from the South Seas in Melanesia, the strait in which sloops of war under Captain Dumont d'Urville ran aground in 1840, and nearly miscarried with all hands, and even the Nautilus, rising superior to every danger in the sea, was about to become intimate with its coral reefs. The Torres Strait is about 34 leagues wide, but it's obscured by an incalculable number of islands, islets, breakers, and rocks that make it nearly impossible to navigate. Consequently, Captain Nemo took every desired precaution in crossing it. Floating flush with the water, the Nautilus moved ahead at a moderate pace. Like a crustacean's tail, its propeller turned the waves slowly. Taking advantage of the situation, my two companions and I found seats on the ever-deserted platform. In front of us stood the pilot house, and unless I'm extremely mistaken, Captain Nemo must have been inside, steering his Nautilus himself. Under my eyes, I had the excellent charts of the Torres Strait that had been surveyed and drawn up by the hydrographic engineer Vincent Dumoulin and Sub-Lieutenant, now Admiral, Coupvent Desbois, who were part of Dumont d'Urville's general staff during his final voyage to surf and navigate the globe. These, along with the efforts of Captain King, are the best charts for untangling the snarl of this narrow passageway, and I consult them with scrupulous care. Around the Nautilus, the sea was boiling furiously. A stream of waves bearing from southeast to northwest, at a speed of 2.5 miles per hour, broke overhead of coral emerging here and there. That's one rough sea, Ned Land told me. Abominable indeed, I replied, and hardly suitable for a craft like the Nautilus. That damned captain, the Canadian went on, must really be sure of his course, because if these clumps of coral so much as brush us, they'll rip our hull into 1,000 pieces. The situation was indeed dangerous, but as if by magic, the Nautilus seemed to glide right down the middle of these rampaging reefs. It didn't follow the exact course of the Zealous and the new Astrolabe, which had proved so ill-fated for Captain Dumont d'Urville. It went more to the north, hugging the Murray Islands, and returned to the southwest near Cumberland Passage. I thought it was about to charge wholeheartedly into this opening, but it went up to the northwest, through a large number of little-known islands and islets, and steered towards Hound Island and the Bad Channel. I was already wondering if Captain Nemo, rash to the point of sheer insanity, wanted his ship to tackle the narrows where Dumont d'Urville's 2 sloops of war had gone aground, when he changed direction a second time and cut straight to the west, heading towards Guabora Island. By then it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The current was slacking off. It was almost full tide. The Nautilus drew near this island, which I can see to this day with its remarkable fringe of screw pines. We hugged it from less than 2 miles out. A sudden jolt threw me down. The Nautilus had just struck a reef, and it remained motionless, listing slightly to port. When I stood up, I saw Captain Nemo and his chief officer on the platform. They were examining the ship's circumstances, exchanging a few words in their incomprehensible dialect. Here is what these circumstances entailed. 2 miles to starboard lay Guabora Island, its coastline curving north to west like an immense arm. To the south and east, heads of coral were already on display, left uncovered by the ebbing waters. We had run aground at full tide in one of those seas whose tides are moderate, an inconvenient state of affairs for floating the Nautilus off. However, the ship hadn't suffered in any way, so solidly joined was its hull. But although it could neither sink nor split open, it was in serious danger of being permanently attached to these reefs, and that would have been the finish of Captain Nemo's submersible. I was mulling this over when the captain approached, cool and calm, forever in control of himself, looking neither alarmed nor annoyed. "An accident?" I said to him. "No, an incident," he answered me. "But an incident," I replied, "that may oblige you to become a resident again of these shores you avoid." Captain Nemo gave me an odd look and gestured no, which told me pretty clearly that nothing could ever force him to set foot on a landmass again. Then he said, "No, Professor Arnox, the Nautilus isn't co-signed to perdition. It will still carry you through the midst of the ocean wonders. Our voyage is just beginning, and I've no desire to deprive myself so soon of the pleasure of your company." "Even so, Captain Nemo," I went on, ignoring his ironic turn of phrase. "The Nautilus has run aground at a moment when the sea is full. Now then, the tides aren't strong in the Pacific, and if you can't unballast the Nautilus, which seems impossible to me, I don't see how it will float off." "You're right, Professor. The Pacific tides aren't strong," Captain Nemo replied. "But in the Torres Strait, one still finds 1.5 meters difference in level between high and low seas. Today is January 4th, and in 5 days the moon will be full. Now then, I'll be quite astonished if that good-natured satellite doesn't sufficiently raise these masses of water and do me a favor for which I'll be forever grateful." This said, Captain Nemo went below again to the Nautilus' interior, followed by his chief officer. As for our craft, it no longer stirred, staying as motionless as if these coral polyps had already walled it in with their indestructible cement. "Well, sir?" Ned Land said to me, coming up after the captain's departure. "Well, Ned, my friend, we'll serenely wait for the tide on the 9th, because it seems the moon will have the good nature to float us away." "As simple as that." "As simple as that." "So our captain isn't going to drop his anchors, put his engines on the chains, and do anything to haul us off?" "Since the tide will be sufficient," Council replied simply. The Canadian stared at Council, then he shrugged his shoulders. The seaman in him was talking now. "Sir," he answered, "you can trust me when I say this hunk of iron will never navigate again, on the seas or under them. It's only fit to be sold for its weight. So I think it's time we gave Captain Nemo the slip." "Ned, my friend," I replied, "unlike you, I haven't given up on our valiant Nautilus, and in 4 days we'll know where we stand on these Pacific tides. Besides, an escape attempt might be timely if we were in sight of the coast of England or Provence, but in the waterways of Papua it's another story. And we'll always have that as our last resort if the Nautilus doesn't right itself, which I regard as a real calamity." "But wouldn't we at least get the lay of the land?" Ned Land went on. "Here's an island. On this island there are trees. Under those trees land animals loaded with cutlets and roast beef, which I'd be happy to sink my teeth into." "In this instance, our friend Ned is right," Council said, and I side with his views. Couldn't Master persuade his friend Captain Nemo to send the 3 of us ashore, if only so our feet don't lose the knack of treading on the solid parts of our planet? "I can ask him," I replied, "but he'll refuse." "Let Master take the risk," Council said, "and we'll know where we stand on the captain's affability." Much to my surprise, Captain Nemo gave me the permission I asked for, and he did so with grace and alacrity, not even extracting my promise to return on board. But fleeing across the New Guinea territories would be extremely dangerous. I wouldn't have advised Ned Land to try it. Better to be prisoners aboard the Nautilus than to fall in the hands of Papuan natives. The skiff was put at our disposal for the next morning. I hardly needed to ask whether Captain Nemo would be coming along. I likewise assumed that no crewman would be assigned to us, that Ned Land would be in sole charge of piloting the longboat. Besides, the shore lay no more than 2 miles off, and it would be child's play for the Canadian to guide that nimble skiff through these rows of reefs so ill-fated for big ships. The next day, January 5th, after its deck paneling was opened, the skiff was wrenched from its sockets and launched to the sea from the top of the platform. 2 men were sufficient for this operation. The oars were inside the longboat, and we had only to take our seats. At 8 o'clock, armed with rifles and axes, we pulled clear of the Nautilus. The sea was fairly calm. A mild breeze blew from shore. In place by the oars, Council and I rowed vigorously, and Ned steered us to the narrow lanes between the breakers. The skiff handled easily and sped swiftly. Ned Land couldn't conceal his glee. He was a prisoner escaping from prison and never dreamed he would need to re-enter it. Meat, he kept repeating. Now we'll eat red meat. Actual game. A real mess call, by thunder. We're not saying fish aren't good for you, but we mustn't overdo 'em. And a slice of fresh venison grilled over live coals will be a nice change from our standard fare. You glutton, Council replied. You're making my mouth water. It remains to be seen, I said, whether these forests do contain game, and if the types of game aren't of such size that they can hunt the hunter. Fine, Professor Arnox, replied the Canadian, whose teeth seemed to be as honed as the edge of an axe. But if there's no other quadruped on this island, I'll eat tiger sirloin. Our friend Ned grows disturbing, Council replied. Whatever it is, Council went on, any animal having 4 feet without feathers or 2 feet with feathers will be greeted by my very own 1-gun salute. Oh, good, I replied. The reckless Mr. Land is at it again. Don't worry, Professor Arnox. Just keep rowing, the Canadian replied. I only need 25 minutes to serve you one of my own special creations. By 8:30, the Nautilus skiff had just run gently aground on a sandy strand, after successfully clearing the ring of coral that surrounds Guaboro Island. End of chapter. It's interesting they let them onto the island. I'm curious what will happen next. Chapter 21. Some Days Ashore. Stepping ashore had an exhilarating effect on me. Ned Land tested the soil with his foot, as if he were laying claim to it. Yet it had been only 2 months since we had become, as Captain Nemo expressed it, passengers on the Nautilus. In other words, the literal prisoners of its commander. In a few minutes, we were a gunshot away from the coast. The soil was almost entirely metamorphic, but certain dry stream beds were strewn with granite rubble, proving that this island was of primordial origin. The entire horizon was hidden behind a curtain of wonderful forest. Enormous trees, sometimes as high as 200 feet, were linked to each other by garlands of tropical creepers, genuine natural hammocks that swayed in a mild breeze. There were mimosas, okay, banyan trees, beefwood, teakwood, hibiscus, screw pines, palm trees, all mingling in wild profusion, and beneath the shades of their green canopies, at the feet of their gigantic trunks, there grew orchids, leguminous plants, and ferns. Meanwhile, ignoring all these fine specimens of Papunian flora, the Canadian passed up the decorative in favor of the functional. We spotted a coconut palm, beat down some of its fruit, broke them open, and we drank their milk and ate their meat with pleasure that was a protest against our standard fare on the Nautilus. Excellent, Ned Land said. Exquisite, Council replied. And I don't think, the Canadian said, that your Nemo would object to us stashing a cargo of coconuts aboard his vessel. I imagine not, I replied, but he won't want to sample them. Too bad for him, Council said. And plenty good for... Too bad for him, Council said. And plenty good for us, Ned Land shot back. There'll be more left over. A word of caution, Mr. Land, I told the harpooner, who was about to ravage another coconut palm. Coconuts are admirable things, but before we stuff the skiff with them, it would be wise to find out whether this island offers more substances just as useful. Some fresh vegetables would be well received in the Nautilus's pantry. Master is right, Council replied, and I propose we set aside 3 places in our longboat, one for fruit, another for vegetables, and a third for venison, which I still haven't glimpsed the tiniest specimen. Don't give up so easily, Council, the Canadian replied. So let's continue our excursion, I went on. But keep a sharp lookout. This island seems uninhabited, but it still might harbor certain individuals who aren't so finicky about the sort of game they eat. Ned put in, with a meaningful movement of his jaws. Ned! Oh, horrors! Council exclaimed. Ye gods, the Canadian shot back. I'm starting to appreciate the charms of cannibalism. Okay. Ned, don't say that, Council answered. You a cannibal? Why, I'll no longer be safe next to you. Who share your cabin. This means I'll wake up half devoured one fine day. I'm awfully fond of you, Council, my friend, and but not enough to eat you when there's better food around. Then I daren't delay, Council replied. The hunt is on. We absolutely must bag some game to placate this man-eater, or one of these mornings Master won't find enough pieces of his manservant to serve him. While exchanging this chit-chat, we entered beneath the dark canopies of the forest, and for 2 hours we explored it in every direction. We couldn't have been luckier in our search for edible vegetation, and some of the most useful produce in the tropical zones supplied us with the valuable foodstuff missing on board. I mean the breadfruit tree, which is quite abundant in Goabora Island, and there I chiefly noted the seedless variety that in Malaysia is called the rima. This tree is distinguished from other trees by a straight trunk 40 feet high. To the naturalist's eye, its gracefully rounded crown, formed of big multi-lobed leaves, were enough to denote the Atrocarpus that had been so successfully transplanted to the Mascarene Islands east of Madagascar. From its massive greenery, huge globular fruit stood out, a decimeter wide and furnished on the outside with creases that assumed a hexagonal pattern. It's a handy plant that nature gives to regions lacking in wheat. Without needing to be cultivated, it bears fruit 8 months out of the year. Ned Land was on familiar terms with this fruit. He had already eaten it on his many voyages and knew how to cook it its edible substance. So the very sight of it aroused his appetite, and he couldn't control himself. Sir, he told me, I'll die if I don't sample a little breadfruit pasta. Sample some, Ned, my friend. Sample all you like. We're here to conduct experiments. Let's conduct them. It won't take a minute, the Canadian replied. Equipped with a magnifying glass, he lit a fire of dead wood that was soon crackling merrily. Meanwhile, Council and I selected the finest Artocarpus fruit. Some still weren't ripe enough, and their thick skins covered white, slightly fibrous pulp, but a great many others were yellowish and gelatinous, just begging to be picked. This fruit contained no pits. Council brought a dozen of them to Ned Land, who cut them into thick slices and placed them over a fire of live coal, all the while repeating, "You'll see, sir, how tasty this bread is." "Especially since we've gone without baked goods for so long," Council said. "It's more than just bread," the Canadian added. "It's a dainty pastry. You've never eaten any, sir?" "No, Ned." "All right. Get ready for something downright delectable. If you don't come back for seconds, I'm no longer the king of harpooners." After a few minutes, the parts of the fruit exposed to the fire were completely toasted. On the inside, there appeared to be some white pasta, a sort of soft bread center whose flavor reminded me of artichoke. This bread was excellent, I must admit, and I ate it with great pleasure. "Unfortunately," I said, "this pasta won't stay fresh, so it seems pointless to make a supply for on board." "By thunder, sir!" Ned Land exclaimed. "There you go, talking like a naturalist, but meantime I'll be acting like a baker. Council, harvest some of this fruit to take with us when we go back." "And how will you prepare it?" I asked the Canadian. "I'll make a fermented batter from this pulp that'll keep indefinitely without spoiling. When I want some, I'll just cook in the galley on board. It'll have a slightly tart flavor, but you'll find it excellent." "So, Mr. Ned, I see that this bread is all we need." "Not quite, Professor," the Canadian replied. "We need some fruit to go with it, or at least some vegetables." "Then let's look for fruit and vegetables." Then our breadfruit harvesting was done, we took to the trail to complete this dry land dinner. We didn't search in vain, and near noontime we had an ample supply of bananas. This delicious produce from the torrid zones ripen all year round, and the Malaysians, who give them the name pisang, eat them without bothering to cook them. In addition to bananas, we gathered some enormous jackfruit with a very tangy flavor, some tasty mangoes, and some pineapples of unbelievable size. But this foraging took up a good deal of our time, which, even so, we had no cause to regret. Council kept Ned under observation. The harpooner walked in the lead, and during his stroll through the forest, he gathered with sure hands some excellent fruit that should have completed his provisions. "So," Council asked, "you have everything you need, Ned, my friend?" "Humph!" the Canadian put in. "What? You're complaining?" "All this vegetation doesn't make a meal," Ned replied. "Just side dishes, dessert. But where's the soup course? Where's the roast?" "Right," I said. "Ned promised us cutlets, which seems highly questionable to me." "Sir," the Canadian replied, "our hunting not only isn't over, it hasn't even started. Patience. We're sure to end up bumping into some animal with either feathers or fur, if not in this locality, then in another. And if not today, then tomorrow, because we mustn't wander off too far off," the council added. "That's why I propose we return to the skiff." "What? Already?" Ned exclaimed. "We ought to be back before nightfall," I said. "But what hour is it then?" the Canadian asked. 2:00 at least," Council replied. "How time flies on solid ground," exclaimed Mr. Ned Land with a sigh of regret. "Off we go," Council replied. So we returned through the forest, and we completed our harvest by making a clean sweep of some palm cabbages that had to be picked from the crowns of their trees, some small beans that I recognize as the aboro of the Malaysians, and some high-quality yams. We were overloaded when we arrived at the skiff. However, Ned Land still found these provisions inadequate. But fortune smiled on him. Just as we were boarding, he spotted several trees 25 to 30 feet high, belonging to the palm species. As valuable as the Actocarpus, these trees were justly ranked among the most useful produce in Malaysia. They were sago palms, vegetation that grows without being cultivated. Like mulberry trees, they produce by means of shoots and seeds. Ned Land knew how to handle these trees. Taking his axe and wielding it with great vigor, he soon stretched out on the ground 2 or 3 sago palms, whose maturity was revealed by white dust sprinkled over their palm fronds. I watched him more as a naturalist than a man in hunger. He began by removing from each trunk an inch-thick strip of bark that covered a network of long, hopeless hopelessly tangled fibers that were putted with a sort of gummy flour. This flour was the starch-like sago, an edible substance chiefly consumed by the Melanese people. My bad. Hi, Pony. Hi, Ashley. Thank you for the hydrate. For the time being, Ned Land was content to chop these trunks into pieces, as if he were making firewood. Later, he would extract the flour by sifting it through cloth to separate it from fibrous ligaments, let it dry out in the sun, and leave it to harden inside molds. Finally, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, laden with all our treasures, we left the island beach and half an hour later pulled alongside the Nautilus. Nobody appeared on our arrival. The enormous sheet iron cylinder seemed deserted. Our provisions loaded on board, I went below to my stateroom. There I found my supper ready. I ate and then fell asleep. The next day, January 6th, nothing new on board. Not a sound inside, not a sign of life. The skiff stayed alongside in the same place we had left it. We decided to return to Guabora Island. Ned Land hoped for better luck in his hunting than on the day before, and he wanted to visit a different part of the forest. By sunrise, we were off. Carried by an inbound current, the long boat reached the island in a matter of moments. We disembarked, and thinking it best to abide by the Canadians' instincts, we followed Ned Land, whose long legs threatened to outpace us. Ned Land went westward up the coast. Then, fording some stream beds, he reached open plains that were bordered by wonderful forests. Some kingfishers lurked along the water courses, but they didn't let us approach. Their cautious behavior proved to me that these winged creatures knew where they stood on bipeds of our species, and I concluded that if this island wasn't inhabited, at least human beings paid it frequent visits. After crossing a pretty lush prairie, we arrived on the outskirts of a small wood, enlivened by the singing and soaring of a large number of birds. Still, they're merely birds, Council said. But some are edible, the harpooner replied. Wrong, Ned, my friend, Council answered, because I only see ordinary parrots here. Council, my friend, Ned replied in all seriousness. Parrots are like pheasants to people with nothing else on their plates. And I might add, I said, that when these birds are properly cooked, they're at least worth a stab of the fork. Indeed, under the dense foliage of this wood, a whole host of parrots fluttered from branch to branch, needing only the proper upbringing to speak human dialects. At present they were cackling in chorus with parakeets of every color, with solemn cockatoos that seemed to be pondering some philosophical problem, while bright red lories passed by like pieces of bunting borne on the breeze. In the midst of Kaleo parrots ferociously on the wing, Papuan lories painted the subtlest shades of azure, and a whole variety of delightful winged creatures, none terribly edible. However, one bird unique to these shores, which never passed beyond the boundaries of the Aurora and Papuan Islands, was missing from this collection, but I was given a chance to marvel at it soon enough. After crossing through a moderately dense thicket, we again found some plains obstructed by bushes. There I saw some magnificent birds soaring aloft, the arrangement of their long feathers causing them to head into the wind. Their undulating flight, the grace of their aerial curves, and the play of their colors lured and delighted the eye. I had no trouble identifying them. Birds of paradise! I exclaimed. Order Passiforma, Division Callistimora, Council replied. Partridge family? Ned Land asks. I doubt it, Mr. Land. Nevertheless, I'm counting on your dexterity to catch me one of these delightful representatives of tropical nature. I'll give it a try, Professor, though I'm handier with a harpoon than a rifle. Malaysians, who do a booming business in these birds with the Chinese, have various methods of catching them that we couldn't use. Sometimes they set snares on top of the tall trees that the birds of paradise prefer to inhabit, and other times they capture it with a tenacious glue that paralyzes its movements. They will even go as far as to poison the springs where these fowl habitually drink. But in our case, all we could do was fire at them on the wing, which left us little chance of getting one. And in truth, we used up a good part of our ammunition in vain. Near 11 o'clock in the morning, we cleared the lower slopes of the mountains that form the island center, and we still hadn't bagged a thing. Hunger spurred us on. The hunters had counted on consuming the proceeds of their hunting, and they had miscalculated. Luckily, and much to his surprise, Council pulled off a right and left shot and ensured our breakfast. He brought down a white pigeon and a ringdove, which were briskly plucked, hung from a spit, and roasted over a blazing fire of dead wood. While these fascinating animals were cooking, Ned prepared some bread from the artocarpus. Then the pigeon and ringdove were devoured to the bone and declared excellent. Nutmeg, on which these birds habitually gorged themselves, sweetened their flesh and made it delicious eating. "They taste like chicken stuffed with truffles," Council said. "All right, Ned," I asked the Canadian. "Now what do you need?" "Game with 4 paws, Professor Arnox," Ned Land replied. "All these pigeons are only appetizers, snacks. So till I've bagged an animal with cutlets, I won't be happy." "Nor I, Ned, until I've caught a bird of paradise." "Then let's keep hunting," Council replied. "But while heading back to the sea, we've arrived at the foothills of these mountains, and I think we'll do better if we return to the forest regions." It was good advice, and we took it. After an hour's walk, we reached a genuine sago palm forest. A few harmless snakes fled underfoot. Birds of paradise stole off at our approach, and I was in real despair of catching one when Council, walking in the lead, stooped suddenly, gave a triumphant shout, and came back to me, carrying a magnificent bird of paradise. "Oh, bravo, Council!" I exclaimed. "Master is too kind," Council replied. "Not at all, my boy. That was a stroke of genius, catching one of these live birds with your bare hands. If Master will examine it closely, he'll see that I deserve no great praise. And why not, Council? Because this bird is as drunk as a lord." "Drunk?" "Yes, Master. Drunk from the nutmegs it was devouring under the nutmeg tree where I caught it. See, Ned, my friend? See the monstrous results of intemperance?" "Damnation!" the Canadian shot back. "Considering the amount of gin I've had these past 2 months, you've got nothing to complain about." Meanwhile, I was examining the unusual bird. Council was not mistaken. Tipsy from that potent juice, our bird of paradise had been reduced to helplessness. It was unable to fly, it was barely able to walk, but this didn't alarm me, and I just let it sleep off its nutmeg. This bird belonged to the finest of the 8 species credited to Papua and its neighboring islands. It was a great emerald, one of the rarest birds of paradise. It measured 3 decimeters long. Its head was comparatively small, and its eyes, placed near the opening of its beak, were also small, but it offered a wonderful mixture of hues: a yellow beak, brown feet and claws, hazel wings with purple tips, pale yellow head and a scruff of the neck, emerald throat, the belly and chest maroon to brown. 2 strands made of a horned substance covered with down rose over its tail, which was lengthened by long, light feathers of wonderful fineness, and they completed the costume of this marvelous bird that the islanders have poetically named the Sunbird. How I wish I could take this superb bird of Paris back to Paris to make a gift of it to the zoo at the Botanical Gardens, which doesn't own a single live specimen. "So it must be a rarity or something?" the Canadian asked in the tone of a hunter who, from the viewpoint of his art, gives the game a pretty low rating. "A great rarity, my gallant comrade, and above all, very hard to capture alive. And even after they're dead, there's still a major market for these birds, so the natives have figured out how to create fake ones, like people create fake pearls or diamonds." "What?" Council exclaimed. "They make counterfeit birds of paradise?" Yes, Council. And this master familiar with how the islanders go about it? Perfectly familiar. During the easterly monsoon season, birds of paradise lose the magnificent feathers around their tails that naturalists call the below-the-wing feathers. These feathers are gathered by the fowl foragers and skillfully fitted on some poor, previously mutilated parakeet. Then they paint over the suture, varnish the bird, and ship the fruits of their unique labor to museums and collectors in Europe. Good enough, Ned Land put in. If it isn't the right bird, it's still the right feathers, and as long as the merchandise isn't meant to be eaten, I see no great harm. But if my desire were fulfilled by the capture of this bird of paradise, those of our Canadian huntsmen remained unsatisfied. Luckily, near 2 o'clock, Ned Land brought down a magnificent wild pig of the type the natives call Barig Auteng. This animal came in the nick of time for us to bag some real quadruped meat, and it was warmly welcomed. Ned Land proved himself quite gloriously with his gunshot. Hit by an electric bullet, the pig dropped dead on the spot. The Canadian properly skinned and cleaned it, after removing half a dozen cutlets destined to serve as the grilled meat course of our evening meal. Then the hunt was on again, and once more would be marked by the exploits of Ned and Council. In essence, beating in the bushes, the two friends flushed a herd of kangaroos that fled by bounding away with their elastic paws. These animals didn't flee so swiftly that our electric capsules couldn't catch up with them. "Oh, Professor!" shouted Ned Land, whose hunting fever had gone to his brain. "What excellent game, especially in a stew! What a supply for the Nautilus! 2, 3, 5 down! And just think how we'll devour all this meat ourselves while those numbskulls on board won't get a shred." In his uncontrollable glee, I think the Canadian might have slaughtered the whole herd, if he hadn't been so busy talking. But he was content with a dozen of these fascinating marsupials, which make up the first order of aplacental mammals, as Council had just to tell us. These animals were small in stature. They were a species of those rabbit kangaroos that usually dwell in the hollows of trees and are tremendously fast. Although of moderate dimensions, they were at least furnish a meat that's highly prized. We were thoroughly satisfied with the results of our hunting. A gleeful Ned proposed that we return the next day to this magic island, which he had planned to depopulate of its every edible quadruped, but he was reckoning without events. By 6 o'clock in the evening, we were back on the beach. The skiff was aground in its usual place. The Nautilus, looking like a long reef, emerged from the waves 2 miles offshore. Without further ado, Ned Land got down to the important business of dinner. It came wonderfully to the terms with its entire cooking, grilling over the coals, whose cutlets from the bari openg soon gave off a succulent aroma that perfumed the air. But I catch myself following in the Canadian's footsteps. Look at me, in ecstasy over freshly grilled pork. Please grant me a pardon, as I've already granted one to Mr. Land, and on the same grounds. In short, dinner was excellent. 2 ringdoves rounded out this extraordinary menu. Sago pasta, bread from the artocarpus, mangoes, half a dozen pineapples, and fermented liquor from certain coconuts heightened our glee. I suspect for my 2 fine companions weren't quite as clear-headed as one could wish. "What if we don't return to the Nautilus this evening?" Council said. "What if we never return to it?" Ned Land added. Just then a stone whizzed past us, landed at our feet, and cut short the harpooner's proposition. End of chapter.
Oh dear, they're about to get attacked, huh?
Oh wow, we're almost an hour in already. How's everyone doing? I hope everyone's doing okay. Or at least enjoying the story. Doing good, just gaming. Aw, yeah. Gaming time. Alright. Let us continue on. We're 41% of the way through the story. Let's go. Chapter 22. The Lightning Bolts of Captain Nemo. Without standing up, we stared in the direction of the forest, my hand stopping halfway to my mouth. Ned Land's completing its assignment. Stones don't fall from the sky, Council said, or else they deserve to be called meteorites. A second well-polished stone removed a tasty ringdove leg from Council's hand, giving still greater relevance to his observation. We all stood up, rifles to our shoulders, ready to answer any attack. Apes, maybe? Ned Land exclaimed. Nearly, Council replied. Savages. Head for the skiff, I said, moving towards the sea. Indeed, it was essential to beat a retreat because some 20 natives armed with bows and slings appeared barely 100 paces off, on the outskirts of a thicket that masked the horizon to our right. The skiff was grounded 10,000 fathoms away from us. The savages approached without running, but they favored us with a show of the greatest hostility. It was raining stones and arrows. Ned Land was unwilling to leave his provisions behind, and despite the impending danger, he clutched his pig on one side, his kangaroos on the other, and scampered off with respectable speed. In 2 minutes, we were on the strand. Loading provisions and weapons into the skiff, we pushed it to sea and positioning its 2 oars were the work of an instant. We hadn't gone 2 cable lengths when 100 savages, howling and gesticulating, and entered the water up to their waists. I looked to see that if their appearance might draw some of the Nautilus's men into the platform. But no. Lying well out, the enormous machine still seemed completely deserted. 20 minutes later, we boarded ship. The hatches were open. After mooring the skiff, we re-entered the Nautilus interior. I went below the lounge, from which some cords were wafting. Captain Nemo was there, leaning over the organ, deep in a musical trance. Captain! I said to him. He didn't hear me. Captain! I went on, touching him with my hand. He trembled and turned around. Ah, it's you, Professor, he said to me. Well, did you have a happy hunt? Was your herb gathering a success? Hello, Pybro! Welcome to the stream. Hope you're doing well today. Yes, Captain, I replied. But unfortunately, we've brought back a horde of bipeds whose proximity worries me. What sort of bipeds? Savages? Savages, Captain Nemo replied in an ironic tone. You set foot on one of the shores of this globe, Professor, and you're surprised to find savages there? Where aren't there savages? And besides, are they any worse than men elsewhere, these people you call savages? It's 6 in the morning. Well, I hope you're having a good 6 in the morning. But Captain, speaking for myself, sir, I've encountered them everywhere. Well then, I replied, if you don't want to welcome them aboard the Nautilus, you better take some precautions. Easy, Professor, no cause for alarm. But there are a large number of these natives. What's your count? At least 100. Professor Arnox, replied Captain Nemo, whose finger took their place against the organ keys. If every islander in Papua were to gather on the beach, the Nautilus would still have nothing to fear from their attacks. I didn't sleep tonight since I felt something in my stomach and couldn't fall asleep. Oh, I'm sorry, Pybro. Try and get a little bit of rest if you can, okay? The captain's fingers then ran over the instrument's keyboard, and I noticed that he touched only its black keys, which gave his melodies a basically Scottish color. Soon he had forgotten my presence and was lost in a reverie that I no longer tried to dispel. I climbed onto the platform. Night had already fallen because in this low altitude the sun sets quickly, without any twilight. I could see Uoboro Island only dimly, but numerous fires had been kindled on the beach, attesting that the natives had no thoughts of leaving it. For several hours I was left to myself, sometimes musing on the islanders, but no longer fearing them because of the captain's unflappable confidence that had won me over, and sometimes forgetting them to marvel at the splendors of this tropical night. My memories took wing towards France in the wake of these zodiological stars due to twinkle over it in a few hours. The moon shone in the midst of the constellations at their zenith. I then remembered that this loyal, good-natured satellite would return to the same place the day after tomorrow, to raise the tide and tear the Nautilus from its coral bed. Near midnight, seeing that all was quiet over the darkened waves as well as under the waterside trees, I repaired to my cabin and fell to a peaceful sleep. I'll go now, try to rest before breakfast. That sounds like a good plan, Pybro. Good luck. The night passed without mishap. No doubt the Papuans had been frightened off by the mere sight of this monster aground in the bay, because our hatches stayed open, offering easy access to the Nautilus's interior. At 6 o'clock in the morning, January 8th, I climbed onto the platform. The morning shadows were lifting. The island was soon on view through the dissolving mists, first at its beaches, then its summits. The islanders were still there, in greater numbers than on the day before, perhaps 500 or 600 of them. Taking advantage of the low tide, some of them had moved forward over the heads of coral to within 2 cable lengths of the Nautilus. I could easily distinguish them. They obviously were true Papuans, men of fine stock, athletic in build, forehead high and broad, nose large but not flat, teeth white. Their woolly, red-tinted hair was in sharp contrast to their bodies, which was tongue. Stop it. It was black and glistening with those of the Nibuans. Beneath their pierced, distended earlobes were dangled strings of bead made from bone. Generally, these savages were naked. I noted some women among them, dressed from hip to knee in grass skirts held by belts made of vegetation. Some of the chieftains adorned their necks with crescents and with necklaces made from beads of red and white glass. Armed with bows, arrows, and shields, nearly all of them carried with their shoulders a sort of net, which held those polished stones their slings hurled with such dexterity. One of these chieftains came fairly close to the Nautilus, examining it with care. He must have been a Mado of high rank, because he paraded with a mat of banana leaves that had ragged edges and was accented with bright colors. I could easily have picked off this islander. He stood at such close range, but I thought it best to wait for an actual show of hostility. Between Europeans and savages, it's acceptable for Europeans to shoot back, but not to attack first. During this whole time of low tide, the islanders lurked near the Nautilus, but weren't boisterous. I often heard them repeat the word asai. From their gestures, I understood they were inviting me to go ashore, an invitation I felt obligated to decline. So this gift didn't leave the ship's side that day, much to the displeasure of Mr. Land, who couldn't complete his provisions. The adroit Canadian spent his time preparing the meat and flour products he had brought from the Guiboro Islands. As for the savages, they went back to the shore near 11 o'clock in the morning, where the heads of coral began to disappear under the waves of the rising tide. But then I saw their numbers swell considerably on the beach. It was likely they had come from neighboring islands or from the mainland of Papua proper. However, I didn't see one local dugout canoe. Having nothing better to do, I decided to dredge these beautiful, clean waters, which exhibited a profusion of shells, zoophytes, and open sea plants. Besides, it was the last day of the Nautilus would spend in these waterways if, tomorrow, it still floated off to the open sea as Captain Nemo had promised. So I summoned counsel, who brought me a small, light danged net similar to those used in oyster fishing. "What about these savages?" Counsel asked me. "With all due respect, master, they don't strike me as very wicked." They're cannibals even so, my boy. A person can be both a cannibal and a decent man, Council replied, just as a person can be both gluttonous and honorable. The one doesn't exclude the other. Fine, Council. And I agree that there are honorable cannibals who decently devour their prisoners. However, I'm opposed to being devoured, and even if in all decency, I'll keep on my guard, especially since the Nautilus commander seems to be taking no precautions. And for now, let's go to work. For 2 hours, our fishing proceeded energetically, but without bringing up any rarities. Our dragnet was filled with midna's abalone, harp shells, obelisk snails, and especially the finest hammer shells I had seen to that day. We also gathered a few sea cucumbers, some pearl oysters, and a dozen small turtles that we saved for the ship's pantry. But just as I least expected it, I laid my hands on a wonder, a natural deformity I have to call it, something very seldom encountered. Council had just made a cast of the dragnet, and his gear had come back up loaded with a variety of fairly ordinary seashells. Then suddenly he saw me plunge my arms swiftly into the net, pull out a shelled animal, and give a conchological yell, in other words, the most piercing yell a human throat can produce. Eh? What happened to Master? Council asked, very startled. Did Master get bitten? No, my boy, but I'd gladly have sacrificed a finger for such a find. What find? This shell, I said, displaying the subject of my triumph. But that's simply an olive shell of the tint olive species, genus Olivia, order Pentinibranchia, class Gastropodia, branch Mollusca. Yes, Council, but instead of coiling from right to left, these olive shells roll from left to right. It can't be, Council exclaimed. Yes, my boy, it's a left-handed shell. A left-handed shell, Council repeated, his heart pounding. Look at its spiral. Oh, Master can trust me on this, Council said, taking the valuable shell in his trembling hands. But never have I felt such excitement. And there was good reason to be excited. In fact, as naturalists have ventured to observe, dextrality is a well-known law of nature. In their rotational and orbital movements, stars and their satellites go from right to left. Man uses his right hand more often than his left, and consequently his various instruments and equipment, staircases, locks, watch springs, etc., are designed to be used to a right-to-left manner. Now then, nature has generally obeyed this law in coiling their shells. They're right-handed with only rare exceptions, and when by chance a shell's spiral is left-handed, collectors will pay its weight in gold for it. So Council and I were deep in contemplation of our treasure, and I was seldomly promising myself to enrich the Paris Museum with it, when an ill-timed stone, hurled by one of the islanders, whizzed over and shattered the valuable object in Council's hands. I gave a yell of despair. Council produced his rifle and aimed it at a savage swinging its sling just 10 meters away from him. I tried to stop him, but his shot went off and shattered a bracelet of amulets dangling from the islander's arms. Council! I shouted. Council! What? Didn't Master see that this man-eater initiated the attack? A shell isn't worth a human life, I told him. Oh, the rascal! Council exclaimed. I'd rather he cracked my shoulder. Council was in dead earnest, but I didn't subscribe to his views. However, the situation had changed in only a short time, and we hadn't noticed. Now some 20 dugout canoes were surrounding the Nautilus. Hollowed by tree trunks, these dugouts were long, narrow, and well designed for speed, keeping their balance by means of 2 bamboo poles that floated on the surface of the water. They were maneuvered by skillful, half-naked paddlers, and I viewed their advance with definite alarm. It was obvious these Papuans had already entered into relations with the Europeans and knew their ships, with this long iron cylinder laying in the bay with no mast or funnels. What were they to make of it? Nothing good, because at first they kept at a respectful distance. However, seeing that it stayed motionless, they regained confidence little by little and tried to become more familiar with it. Now then, it is precisely this familiarity that we needed to prevent. Since our weapons made no sound when they went off, they would have only a moderate effect on these islanders. who reputedly respected nothing but noisy mechanisms. Without thunderclaps, lightning bolts would be much less frightening, although the danger lies in the flash, not the noise. Just then, the dugout canoes drew nearer to the Nautilus, and a cloud of arrows burst over us. "Fire and brimstone, it's hailing," Council said. "And poison and hail, perhaps." "We've got to alert Captain Nemo," I said, re-entering the hatch. I went below to the lounge, found no one there. I ventured a knock at the door opening into the captain's stateroom. The word "enter" answered me. I did so and found Captain Nemo busy with calculations in which there was no shortage of X and other algebraic signs. "Am I disturbing you?" I said out of politeness. "Correct, Professor Arnox," the captain answered me. "But I imagine you have pressing reasons for looking me up." "Very pressing. Native dugout canoes are surrounding us, and in a few minutes we're sure to be assaulted by several hundred savages." "Ah," Captain Nemo put in serenely. "They've come in their dugouts?" "Yes, sir." "Well, sir, closing the hatches should do the trick." "Precisely, and that's what I came to tell you. Nothing easier," Captain Nemo said, and he pressed an electric button, transmitting an order to the crew's quarters. "There, sir, all under control. There, sir, all under control," he told me after a few moments. "The skiff is in its place and the hatches are closed. I don't imagine you were worried about those gentlemen will stay if in walls the hatches are closed. Save in walls that shells from your frigate couldn't breach." "No, Captain, but one danger still remains." "What's that, sir?" Tomorrow at about this time, we'll need to reopen the hatches to renew the Nautilus's air." "No argument, sir, since our craft breaches in a manner favored by cetaceans. But if these Papuans are occupying the platform at that moment, I don't see how you can prevent them from entering." "Then, sir, you assume they'll board the ship?" "I'm certain of it." "Well, sir, let them come aboard. I see no reason to prevent them. Deep down, they're just poor devils, these Papuans, and I don't want to visit my Giborian islands to cost the life of a single one of these unfortunate people." On this note, I was about to withdraw, but Captain Nemo detained me and invited me to take a seat next to him. He questioned me with interest of our excursions ashore and on our hunting, but seemed not to understand the Canadian's passionate craving for red meat. Then our conversation skimmed various subjects, and without being more forthcoming, Captain Nemo proved more affable. "Hello, I made it this time. Hello, noob! Welcome to the stream. I hope you're doing well today." Among other things, we came to talk of the Nautilus' circumstances, aground in the same strait where Captain Dumont d'Urville had nearly miscarried. Then, pertinent to this, He was one of your great seamen," the captain told me. "One of your shrewdest navigators, that d'Urville. He was the Frenchman's Captain Cook. A man wise but unlucky, braving the ice banks of the South Pole, the coral of Oceania, the cannibals of Pacific, only to perish wretchedly in a train wreck. If that energetic man was able to think about his life in its last seconds, imagine what his thoughts must have been." As he spoke, Captain Nemo seemed deeply moved, an emotion I felt was to his credit. Then, chart in hand, we returned to the deeds of the French navigator, his voyages to circumnavigate the globe, his double attempt at the South Pole, which led to his discovery of the Adelaide coast and the Louis Philippe Peninsula, finally his hydrographic surveys of the chief islands of Oceania. What your d'Urville did on the surface of the sea, Captain Nemo told me, I've done in the ocean's interior, but more easily, more completely than he. Constantly he tossed about by hurricanes, the Zealous and the new astrolabe couldn't compare with the Nautilus, a quiet workroom truly at rest in the midst of the waters. "Even so, Captain," I said, "there is one major similarity between Dumont d'Urville's sloops of war and the Nautilus." "What's that, sir?" "Like them, the Nautilus has run aground." "The Nautilus is not aground, sir," Captain Nemo replied icily. "The Nautilus was built to rest on the ocean floor, and I don't need to undertake the arduous labors, the maneuvers d'Urville had to attempt in order to float off his sloops of war. The Zealous and the new astrolabe well nigh perished, but my Nautilus is in no danger. Tomorrow, by the day stated and at the hour stated, tide will peacefully lift it off, and it will resume its navigating through the seas. Captain, I said, I don't doubt tomorrow. Captain Nemo added, standing up. Tomorrow at 2:40 in the afternoon, the Nautilus will float off and exit the Torres Strait undamaged. Pronouncing these words in an extremely sharp tone, Captain Nemo gave me a curt bow. This was my dismissal, and I re-entered my stateroom. There I found Council, who wanted to know the upshot of my interview with the captain. My boy, I replied. When I expressed the belief that these Papua natives were a threat to his Nautilus, Captain answered me with great irony. So I've just one thing to say to you. Have faith in him and sleep in peace. Master has no need for my services. No, my friend. What's Ned Land up to? Begging Master's indulgence, Council replied. But our friend Ned is concocting a kangaroo pie that will be the 8th wonder. I was left to myself. I went to bed but slept pretty poorly. I kept hearing noises from the savages, who were stamping on the platform and letting out deafening yells. The night passed on in its way, without the crew ever emerging from their usual inertia. They were no more disturbed by the presence of these man-eaters than soldiers in an armed fortress are disturbed by ants running over the armored plate. I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning. The hatches weren't open, so the air inside hadn't been renewed, but the air tanks was kept full for any eventuality and would function appropriately to shoot a few cubic meters of oxygen into the Nautilus's thin atmosphere. I worked in my stateroom until noon without seeing Captain Nemo even for an instant. Nobody on board seemed to be making any preparations for departure. I still waited for a while, then I made my way to the main lounge. Its timepiece marked 2:30. In 10 minutes, the tide would reach its maximum elevation, and if Captain Nemo hadn't made a rash promise, the Nautilus would immediately break free. If not, many months might pass before it could leave its coral bed. But some preliminary vibrations would soon be felt over the boat's hull. I heard its plating grind against the limestone roughness of that coral base. At 2:35, Captain Nemo appeared in the lounge. We're about to depart, he said. Ah, I put in. We've given orders to open the hatches. What about the Papuans? What about them? Captain Nemo replied with a slight shrug of his shoulders. Won't they come inside the Nautilus? How will they manage that? By jumping down the hatches you're about to open. Professor Arnox, Captain Nemo replied serenely. The Nautilus hatches aren't to be entered in that fashion even when they're open. I gaped at the captain. You don't understand, he said to me. Not in the least. Well, come along and you'll see. I headed to the central companionway. There, very puzzled, Ned Land and Council watched the crewmen opening the hatches, while a frightful clamor and furious shouts resounded outside. The hatch lid fell back into the outer plating. 20 horrible faces appeared, but then, when the first islander laid hands on the companionway railing, he was flung backwards by some invisible power, Lord knows what. He ran off, howling in terror and wildly pacing around. 10 of his companions followed him. All 10 meant the same fate. Council was in ecstasy. Carried away by his violent instincts, Ned Land leaped up the companionway, but as soon as his hand seized the railing, he was thrown backwards in his turn. Damnation! He exclaimed. I've been struck by a lightning bolt! These words explained everything to me. It wasn't just a railing that led the platform. It was a metal cable fully charged with the ship's electricity. Anyone who touched it got a fearsome shock. Such a shock would have been fatal if Captain Nemo had thrown the full current from his equipment into the conducting cable. It could honestly be said that he had stretched between himself and his assailants a network of electricity so no one could clear with impunity. Meanwhile, with crazed terror, the unhinged Papuans beat a retreat. As for us, half laughing, we massaged and comforted poor Ned Land, who was swearing like one possessed. But just then, lifted off by the tide's final undulations, the Nautilus left its coral beds at exactly that 40th minute pinpointed by the captain. Its propeller churned the waves with lazy majesty. Gathering speed little by little, the ship navigated on the surface of the ocean, safe and sound. They left behind the dangerous narrows of the Torres Strait. End of chapter.
That was neat.
The Nautilus is just super nifty as a ship, I have to say. I like it. Yes. Alright. This is great to listen to while playing Sea of Thieves. Yes. Alright. Chapter 23. Agiri Samina. The following day, January 10th, the Nautilus resumed its travels in mid-water, but at a remarkable speed that I estimated to be at least 35 meters per hour. The propeller was going so fast I could neither follow nor count its revolutions. I thought about how this marvelous electric force not only gave motion, heat, and light to the Nautilus, but even protected it against outside attack, transforming it into a sacred ark no profane hand could touch without being blasted. My wonderment was boundless, and it went from the submersible itself to the engineer who had created it. We were traveling due west, and on January 11th, we doubled Cape Wessel, located in longitude 135 degrees and latitude 10 degrees north. The western tip of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Reefs were still numerous, but more widely scattered, and were fixed on the chart with the greatest accuracy. The Nautilus easily avoided the breakers to port and the Victoria Reefs to starboard, positioned at longitude 130 degrees on the 10th parallel, which we went along rigorously. On January 13th, arriving at the Timor Sea, Captain Nemo raised the island of that name at longitude 122 degrees. This island, whose surface area measured 1,625 square leagues, is governed by Rajas. These aristocrats deemed themselves the sons of crocodiles, in other words, descendants with the most exalted origins to which a human being can lay claim. Accordingly, their scaly ancestors infest the island's rivers and are the subject of special veneration. They are sheltered, nurtured, flattered, pampered, and offered a ritual diet of nubile maidens. And woe to the foreigner who lifts a finger against these sacred saurians. But the Nautilus wanted nothing to do with these nasty animals. Timor Islands was visible for barely an instant at noon while the chief officer determined his position. I also caught only a glimpse of little Roti Island, part of this same group, whose women have a well-established reputation for beauty in the Malaysian marketplace. After our position fixed, the Nautilus latitude bearing were modulated to the southwest. Our prow pointed to the Indian Ocean. Where would Captain Nemo's fancies take us? Would he head up to the shores of Asia? Would he pull nearer to the beaches of Europe? Unlikely choices for a man who avoided populated areas. So would he go down south? Would he double the Cape of Good Hope, then Cape Horn, and push us on to the Atlantic Pole? Finally, would he return to the seas of the Pacific, where his Nautilus could navigate freely and easily? Time would tell. After cruising along the Crater, Hibernia, Patan, and Scott Reefs, the solid element's last excursions against the liquid element, we were beyond all sight of shore by January 14th. The Nautilus slowed down in an odd manner, in very unpredictable ways. In its ways, it sometimes swam in the midst of the waters, sometimes drifted on their surface. During this phase of our voyage, Captain Nemo conducted interesting experiments on the different temperatures and various strata of the sea. Under ordinary conditions, such readings are obtained using some pretty complicated instruments, though whose findings are dubious to say the least, whether they're thermometric sounding lines, whose glass often shatters under the water's pressure, or those devices based on the varying resistance of metals to electric currents. Results so obtained can't be adequately double-checked. By contrast, Captain Nemo would seek the sea's temperature by going himself into its depths, where he placed his thermometer in contact with the various layers of liquid. He found the sought for degrees immediately and with certainty. And so, by loading up the ballast tanks, or by sinking obliquely with its slanting fins, the Nautilus successfully reached depths of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000, and 10,000 meters. And the ultimate conclusion from these experiments was that, in all latitudes, the sea had a permanent temperature of 4.5 degrees centigrade at a depth of 1,000 meters. 10,000 leagues, it seems so. Well, meters at least. Also, they completely mixed 6,000 meters and 8,000 meters. Whoops-a-doodle, I guess. I watched these experiments with the most intense fascination. Captain Nemo brought a real passion to them. I often wondered why he took these observations. Were they for the benefits of his fellow man? It was unlikely, because sooner or later his work would perish with him in some unknown sea, unless he intended the results of his experiments for me. But that meant this strange voyage of mine would come to an end, and no such end was in sight. Be it that as it may, Captain Nemo also introduced me to the different data he had attained on the relative densities of the water in our globe's chief seas. From this news I derived some personal enlightenment, for having nothing to do with science. It happened the morning of January 15th. The captain, with whom I was strolling on the platform, asked me if I knew how salt water differs in density from sea to sea. I said no, adding that there was a lack of rigorous scientific observations on the subject. "I've taken such observations," he told me, "and I can vouch for their reliability." "Fine," I replied, "but the Nautilus lives in a separate world. The secrets of its scientists don't make their way ashore." "You're right, Professor," he told me after a few moments of silence. "This is a separate world. It's as alien to the Earth as the planets accompanying our globe around the sun, and we'll never become familiar with the works of scientists on Saturn or Jupiter. But since fate has linked our two lives, I can reveal the results of my observations to you." "I'm all attention, Captain." "You're aware, Professor, that salt water is denser than fresh water, but this density isn't uniform. In essence, if I represent the density of fresh water by 1.000, then I find 1.028 for the waters of the Atlantic, 1.026 for the waters of the Pacific, 1.030 for the waters of the Mediterranean. Aha, I thought. So he ventures into the Mediterranean. 1.018 for the waters of the Ionian Sea, and 1.029 for the waters of the Adriatic. Assuredly, the Nautilus didn't avoid the heavily traveled seas of Europe. From this insight, I concluded that the ship would take us back, perhaps very soon, to more civilized shores. I expected Ned Land to greet this news with unfeigned satisfaction. For several days, our work hours were spent in all sorts of experiments, on the degree of salinity of waters at different depths, or on their electric properties, coloration, and transparency. And in every instance, Captain Nemo displayed an ingenuity equaled only by his graciousness towards me. Then I saw no more of him in some days, and again lived on board in seclusion. On January 16th, the Nautilus seemed to have fallen asleep just a few meters beneath the surface of the water. Its electric equipment had been turned off, and the motionless propeller let it ride with the waves. I assumed that the crew were busy with interior repairs, required by the engine's strenuous mechanical action. My companions and I then witnessed an unusual sight. The panels in the lounge were open, and since the Nautilus's beacon was off, a hazy darkness reigned in the midst of the waters. Covered with heavy clouds, the stormy sky gave only the faintest light in the ocean's upper strata. I was observing the state of the sea under these conditions, and even the largest fish were nothing more than ill-defined shadows. Then the Nautilus was suddenly transformed in broad daylight. Transferred into broad daylight. At first I thought the beacon had gone back on and was casting its electrical light on the liquid mass. I was mistaken, and after a hasty examination I discovered my error. The Nautilus had drifted into the midst of some phosphorescent strata, which in this darkness came off positively dazzling. This effect was caused by myriads of tiny, luminous animals whose brightness increased when they glided over the metal hull of our submersible. In the midst of these luminous sheets of water, I then glimpsed the flashes of light, like those seen inside a blazing furnace from streams of molten lead or from masses of metal brought into a white heat, flashes so intense that certain areas of the light became shadows by comparison. In a fiery setting from which every shadow could seemingly have been banished. No, this was no longer the common immersion of our usual lighting. This light throbbed with unprecedented vigor and activity. You sensed that it was alive. In essence, it was a cluster of countless open sea infusoria, of Noticulia lisha, an eighth of an inch wide, actual globules of transparent jelly equipped with a thread-like tentacle, up to 25,000 of which had been counted in 30 cubic centimeters of water. And the power of their light was increased by the glimmers unique to medusas, starfish, common jellyfish, angel wing clams, and other phosphorescent zoophytes, which was saturated with grease from organic matter decomposed by the sea, perhaps with mucus secreted by fish. For several hours the Nautilus drifted in this brilliant tide, and our wonderment grew when we saw huge marine animals cavorting in it, like the fire-dwelling salamanders of myth. In the midst of these flames that didn't burn, I could see swift, elegant porpoises, the tireless pranksters of the sea, and sailfish 3 meters long, those shrewd heralds of hurricanes whose fearsome broadswords sometimes banged against the lounge window. These smaller fish appeared, miscellaneous triggerfish, leatherjacks, unicorn fish, and 100 others that left stripes on this luminous atmosphere in their course. Some magic lay behind this dazzling sight. Perhaps some atmospheric condition had intensified this phenomenon. Perhaps a storm had been unleashed on the surface of the waves. But only a few meters down, the Nautilus felt no tempest fury, and the ship rocked peacefully in the midst of the calm waters. And so it went, some new wonder constantly delighting us. Council observed and classified his zoophytes, arculates, mollusks, and fish. The day passed quickly, and I no longer kept track of them. Ned, as usual, kept looking for changes of pace from our standard fare. Like actual snails, we were at home in our shell, and I can vouch that it's easy to turn into a full-fledged snail. So this way of living began to seem simple and natural to us, and we no longer envisioned a different lifestyle on the surface of the planet Earth, when something happened to remind us of our strange circumstances. On January 18th, the Nautilus lay at longitude 105 degrees and latitude 15 degrees south. The weather was threatening, the sea rough and billowy. The wind was blowing a strong gust from the east. The barometer, which had been falling for some days, forecast an approaching struggle of the elements. I had climbed onto the platform just as the chief officer was taking his readings of 4-hour angles. Out of habit, I waited for him to pronounce his daily phrase, but that day it was replaced by a different phrase, just as incomprehensible. Almost at once I saw Captain Nemo appear, lift his spyglass, and inspect the horizon. For some minutes the captain stood motionless, rooted to the spot contained within the field of his lens. Then he lowered his spyglass and exchanged about 10 words with his chief officer. The latter seemed to be in the grip of an excitement he tried in vain to control. The more in command of himself, Captain Nemo remained cool. Furthermore, he seemed to be raising certain objections to his chief officer, who kept answering with flat assurances. At least that's what I gathered from their differences in tone and gesture. As for me, I stared incredulously in the direction under observation, but without spotting a thing. Sky and water merged into a perfect clean horizon line. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo strolled from one end of the platform to the other, not glancing at me, perhaps not even seeing me. His step was firm but less regular than usual. Sometimes he would stop, cross his arms over his chest, and observe the sea. What could he be looking for over that immense expanse? By then, the Nautilus lay hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. The chief officer kept lifting his spyglass and stubbornly examining the horizon, walking up and down, stamping his foot with his nervous agitation, a sharp contrast to his superior. But this mystery would inevitably be cleared up and soon, because Captain Nemo gave orders to increase speed. At once the engine sped up its drive power, setting the propeller in swifter rotation. Just then the chief officer drew the captain's attention anew. The latter interrupted his strolling and aimed his spyglass at the point indicated. He observed it for a good while. As for me, deeply puzzled, I went below to the lounge and brought back an excellent long-range telescope I habitually used. Leaning my elbows on the beacon housing, which jutted from the stern of the platform, I got set to scour the whole stretch of sky and sea. But no sooner had I peered into the eyepiece that the instrument was snatched from my hands. I spun around. Captain Nemo was standing before me, but I almost didn't recognize him. His facial features were transfigured. Gleaming with dark fire, his eyes had shrunk beneath his furrowing brow. His teeth were half bared. His rigid body, clenched fists, and head drawn between his shoulders, all attested to a fierce hate breathing from every pore. He didn't move. My spyglass fell from his hands and rolled at his feet. Had I accidentally caused these symptoms of anger? Did this incomprehensible individual think I had detected some secret forbidden to his guests on the Nautilus? No, I wasn't the subject of his hate because he wasn't even looking at me. His eyes stayed firmly focused on the inscrutable point of the horizon. Finally, Captain Nemo regained his self-control. His facial appearance, so profoundly changed, now resumed its usual calm. He addressed a few words to his chief officer in their strange language. Then he turned to me. "Professor Arnox," he told me in a tone of some urgency. I ask that you now honor one of the binding agreements between us." "Which one, Captain?" "You and your companions must be placed in confinement till I see fit to set you free." "You're in command," I answered, gaping at him. "But may I address a question to you?" "You may not, sir." After that, I stopped objecting and started obeying. Since resistance was useless, I went below to the cabin occupied by Ned and Council, and I informed them of the captain's decision. I'll let the reader decide how the news was received by the Canadian. In any case, there was no time for explanations. 4 crewmen were waiting at the door, and they led us to the cell where we had spent our first night aboard the Nautilus. Ned Land tried to lodge a complaint, but the only answer he got was a door shut in his face. "What will Master tell me what this means?" Council asked me. I told my companions what had happened. They were as astonished as I was, but no wiser. Then I sank into deep speculation, and Captain Nemo's strange facial seizure kept haunting me. I was incapable of connecting 2 ideas in logical order, and I had strayed into the most absurd hypothesis, when I was snapped out of my mental struggles by these words from Ned Land. "Well, look here! Lunch is served!" Indeed, the table had been laid. Apparently, Captain Nemo had given this order at the same time he commanded the Nautilus to pick up speed. "Will Master allow me to make him a recommendation?" Council asked me. "Yes, my boy," I replied. "Well, Master needs to eat his lunch. It's prudent, because we have no idea what the future holds." "You're right, Council." "Unfortunately," Ned Land said, "they've only given us the standard menu." "Ned, my friend," Council answered, "what would you say if they'd given us no lunch at all?" This dose of sanity cut the harpooner's complaints clean off. We sat down at the table. Our meal proceeded pretty much in silence. I ate very little. Council, everlasting prudent, force-fed himself, and despite the menu, Ned Land didn't waste a bite. Then, lunch over, each of us propped himself in a corner. Just then, the luminous globe lighting our cell went out, leaving us in profound darkness. Ned Land soon dozed off, and to my astonishment, Council also fell into a heavy slumber. I was wondering what could have caused this urgent need for sleep when I felt a dense torpor saturate my brain. I tried to keep my eyes open, but they closed in spite of me. I was in the grip of anguished hallucinations. Obviously, some sleep-inducing substance had been laced into our food we'd just eaten. So imprisonment wasn't enough to conceal Captain Nemo's plans for us. Sleep was needed as well. Then I heard the hatches close. The sea's undulations, which had been creating a gentle rocking motion, now ceased. Had the Nautilus left the surface of the ocean? Was it re-entering the motionless strata deep in the sea? I tried to fight off this drowsiness. It was impossible. My breathing grew weaker. I felt a mortal chill freeze my dull, nearly paralyzed limbs. Like little domes of lead, my lids fell over my eyes. I couldn't raise them. A morbid sleep, full of hallucinations, seized my whole being. Then the visions disappeared and left me in utter oblivion. End of chapter. Uh-oh. This is certainly going in some direction. Chapter 24. The Coral Realm. The next day, I woke up with my head unusually clear. Much to my surprise, I was in my stateroom. No doubt my companions had been put in their cabin without noticing it any more than I had. Like me, they would have no idea what took place during the night, and to unravel this mystery I could count only on some future happenstance. I then considered leaving my stateroom. Was I free or still a prisoner? Perfectly free. I opened my door, headed down the gangways, and climbed into the central companionway. Hatches that had been closed the day before were now open. I arrived on the platform. Ned Land and Council were there waiting for me. I questioned them. They knew nothing. Lost in a heavy sleep of which they had no memory, they were quite startled to be back in their cabin. As for the Nautilus, it seemed as tranquil and mysterious as ever. It was cruising on the surface of the waves at a moderate speed. Nothing seems to have changed on board. Ned Land observed the sea with his penetrating eyes. It was deserted. The Canadian sighted nothing new on the horizon, neither sail nor shore. A breeze was billowing noisily from the west, and disheveled by the wind, long billows made of the submersible rolled very noticeably. After renewing its air, the Nautilus stayed at an average depth of 15 meters, enabling it to return quickly to the surface of the waves. And, contrary to custom, it executed such a maneuver several times during that day of January 19th. The chief officer would then climb aboard the platform, and his usual phase would ring through the ship's interior. As for Captain Nemo, he didn't appear. Of the other men on board, I only saw my emotionless steward, who served me with his usual mute efficiency. Near 2 o'clock, I was busy organizing my notes in the lounge, when the captain opened the door and appeared. I bowed to him. He gave me an almost imperceptible bow in return, without saying a word to me. I resumed my work, hoping he might give me some explanation of the previous afternoon events. He did nothing of the sort. I stared at him. His face looked exhausted. His reddened eyes hadn't been refreshed by sleep. His facial features expressed profound sadness, real chagrin. He walked up and down, sat and stood, picked up a book at random, discarded it immediately, consulted his instruments without taking his customary notes, and seemed unable to rest easy for an instant. Finally, he came over to me and said, "Are you a physician, Professor Arnox?" This inquiry was so unexpected that I stared at him with a good while without replying. "Are you a physician?" he replied. "Several of your scientific colleagues took their degrees in medicine, such as Gartielet, Macrindandon, and others." "That's right," I said. "I am a doctor. I used to be on call at the hospitals. I was in practice for several years before joining the museum." "Excellent, sir. My reply obviously pleased Captain Nemo, but not knowing what he was driving at, I waited for further questions, ready to reply as circumstances dictated. Professor Arnox, the captain said to me, would you consent to give your medical attention to one of my men? Someone is sick. Yes. I'm ready to go with you. Come. I admitted that my heart was pounding. Lord knows why, but I saw a definite connection between the sick crewman and yesterday's happening, and the mystery of those events concerned me at least as much as the man's sickness. Captain Nemo led me to the Nautilus stern and invited me into a cabin located next to the sailors' quarters. On a bed there lay a man some 40 years old with strongly molded features, the very image of an Anglo-Saxon. I bent over him. Not only was he sick, he was wounded. Swathed in blood-soaked linen, his head was resting in a folded pillow. I undid the linen bandages while the wounded man gazed with great staring eyes and let me proceed without making a single complaint. It was a horrible wound. The cranium had been smashed open by some blunt instrument, leaving the naked brains exposed, and the cerebellar matter was suffered deep abrasions. Blood clots had formed in its dissolving masses, taking on the color of wine dregs. Both contusion and concussion of the brain had occurred. The sick man's breathing was labored. The muscle spasms quivered on his face. Cerebral inflammation was complete and had brought on a paralysis of movement and sensation. I took the wounded man's pulse. It was intermittent. The body's extremities were already growing cold, and I saw that death was approaching without any possibility of my holding it in check. After dressing the poor man's wounds, I redid the linen bandages around his head, and I turned to Captain Nemo. How did he get this wound? I asked him. That's not important, the captain replied evasively. The Nautilus suffered a collision that cracked one of the engine levers, and it struck this man. My chief officer was standing beside him. The man leaped forward to intercept the blow. A brother laid down his life for his brother, a friend for his friend. What could be simpler? That's how the law for everyone on board the Nautilus. But what's your diagnosis of his condition? I hesitated to speak my mind. You may talk freely, the captain told me. This man doesn't understand French. I took a last look at the wounded man, then I replied, This man will be dead in 2 hours. Nothing can save him. Nothing. Captain Nemo clenched his fist, and tears slid from his eyes, which I had thought incapable of weeping. For a few moments I observed the dying man, whose life was ebbing little by little. He grew still more pale under the electric light that bathed his deathbed. I looked at his intelligent head, furrowed with premature wrinkles that misfortune, perhaps misery, had etched long before. I was hoping to detect the secrets of his life for the past words that might escape from his lips. You may go, Professor Arnox, Captain Nemo told me. I left the captain in the dying man's cabin and repaired to my stateroom, very moved by the scene. All day long I quivered with gruesome forebodings. That night I slept poorly, and between my fitful dreams I thought I heard a distant moaning, like a funeral dirge. What? Was it a prayer for the dead, murmured in a language I couldn't understand? The next morning I climbed deck. Captain Nemo was already there. As soon as he saw me, he came over. Professor, he said to me, would it be convenient for you to take an underwater excursion today? With my companions? I asked. If they're agreeable. We're yours to command, Captain. Then kindly put on your diving suits. As for the dead or dying man, he hadn't come into the picture. I rejoined Ned Land and Council. I informed them of Captain Nemo's proposition. Council was eager to accept, and this time the Canadian proved perfectly amenable to going with us. He needs some milk. He needs some milk! It was 8 o'clock in the morning. By 8:30 we were suited up for this new stroll and equipped with our 2 devices for lighting and breathing. The double door opened, and accompanied by Captain Nemo with a dozen crewmen following, we set foot on the firm sea floor where the Nautilus was resting 10 meters below. Darn it. A gentle slope gravitated to an uneven bottom whose depths was about 15 fathoms. This bottom was completely different from the one I had visited during my first excursion under the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Here I saw no fine-grained sand, no underwater prairies, not one open sea forest. I immediately recognized the wondrous region in which Captain Nemo did the honors that day. It was the coral realm. In the zoophyte branch, class Alcinonara, one finds the order Gorgoniara, which contains 3 groups: sea fans, Ecidian polyps, and coral polyps. It's in this last that precious coral belongs, an unusual substance that, at different times, has been classified in the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. That at the medicine to the ancients, jewelry to the moderns, it wasn't decisively placed into the animal kingdom until 1694 by Paysanel of Marseilles. A coral is a unit of tiny animals assembled into a polyary that's bristle and stony in nature. These polyps have a unique generating mechanism that reproduces them via the budding process, and they have an individual existence while also participating in a communal life. Hence, they embody the sort of natural socialism. I am familiar with the latest research of these bizarre zoophytes, which turns to stone while taking on a tree form, as some naturalists have very aptly observed. And nothing could have been more fascinating to me than to visit one of these petrified forests that nature had planted at the bottom of the sea. We turned to our Ruhmkorff devices and went along a coral shoal and the process of forming, which, given time, will someday close off this whole part of the Indian Ocean. Our path was bordered by hopelessly tangled bushes, formed from snarls of shrubs all covered with little star-shapes, white-streaked flowers. Only, contrary to plants on shore, these tree forms became attached to rocks on the seafloor by heading from top to bottom. Our lights produced 1,000 delightful effects while playing over these brightly colored boughs. I fancied I saw these cylindrical, membrane-filled tubes trembling beneath the water's undulations. I was tempted to gather their flesh petals, which were adorned with delicate tentacles, some newly in bloom, others barely opened, while nimble fish with fluttering fins brushed past them like flocks of birds. But if my hand came near the moving flowers of these sensitive, lively creatures, an alarm would instantly sound throughout the colony. The white petals retracted into their red sheaths, the flowers vanished before my eyes, and the brush changed into a chunk of stony nipples. Sheer chance had placed me into the presence of the most valuable specimen of the zoophyte. This coral was the equal of those fished up from the Mediterranean off of the Barbary coast, or the shores of France and Italy. With its bright colors, it lived up to those poetic names of bloodflower and blood foam from the industry coffers on its finest exhibits. Coral shells for as much as 500 francs per kilogram, and in this locality the liquid strata hid enough to make the fortunes of a whole host of local fishermen. This valuable substance often merges with other polyparies, forming compact, hopelessly tangled units known as Macotia, and I noted some wonderful pink samples of this coral. But as the bushes sank, the tree forms magnified. Actual petrified thickets and long enclosures from some fantastic school of architecture kept opening up before our steps. Captain Nemo entered beneath a dark galley whose gentle slope took us to a depth of 100 meters. The light from our glass coils produced magical effects at times, lingering at the wrinkled roughness of some natural arc, or some overhang suspended like a chandelier, which our lamps flickered from fiery sparks. Amid these shrubs of precious coral, I observed other polyps no less unusual. Melita coral, rainbow coral with jointed outgrowths, then a few tufts of genus Corallina, some green and other red, actually a type of seaweed encrusted with limestone salts, which, with After long disputes, naturalists have finally placed in the vegetable kingdom. But one intellectual has remarked, here perhaps is the actual point where life rises humbly out of slumbering stone, but without breaking away from its crude starting point. Finally, after 2 hours of walking, we reached a depth of about 300 meters. In other words, the lowermost limit of which coral can begin to form. But here it was no longer some isolated bush or a modest grove of low timber. It was an immense forest, huge mineral vegetation, enormous petrified trees linked by the garlands of elegant hydras from the genus Fulmularia, whose tropical creepers of the sea, all decked out in shades and gleams. We passed freely under their lofty boughs, lost in the shadows of the waves, while at our feet organ pipe coral, stony coral, star coral, fungus coral, and sea anemone from the genus Caryophylla formed a carpet of flowers all strewn with dazzling gems. What an indescribable sight! Oh, if only we could share our feelings. Why were we imprisoned behind these masks of metal and glass? Why were we forbidden to talk with each other? At least let us lead the lives of the fish that populate this liquid element, or better yet, the lives of the amphibians, which can spend long hours either at sea or on shore, traveling through their double domain as their whims dictate. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo had called a halt. My companions and I stopped walking, and turning around, I saw the crewmen form a semicircle around their leader. Looking with greater care, I observed that 4 of them were carrying on their shoulders an object that was oblong in shape. At this locality, we stood in the center of a huge clearing surrounded by the tall tree forms of this underwater forest. Our lamps cast a short of brilliant twilight over the area, making inordinately long shadows of the sea floor. Past the boundaries of the clearing, the darkness deepened again, relieved only by little sparkles given off by the sharp crests of coral. Ned Land and Council stood next to me. We stared, and it dawned on me that I was about to witness a strange scene. Observing the seafloor, I saw that it swelled at certain points from low bulges that were encrusted with limestone deposits and arranged with a symmetry that betrayed the hand of man. In the middle of the clearing, on a pedestal of roughly piled rocks, there stood a cross of coral, extending long arms you would have thought were made of petrified blood. At a signal from Captain Nemo, one of his men stepped forward and, a few feet from his cross, detached a mattock from his belt and began to dig a hole. I finally understood. This clearing was a cemetery, this hole a grave. That oblong object, the body of the man who must have died during the night. Captain Nemo and his men had come to bury their companion in this communal resting place on the inaccessible ocean floor. No, my mind was reeling as never before. Never had ideas of such impact raced through my brain. I didn't want to see what my eyes saw. Meanwhile, the grave digging went slowly. Fish fled here and there as their retreat was disturbed. I heard the pick ringing in the limestone soil, its sharp tips sometimes giving off sparks when it hit a spray piece of flint at the sea bottom. The hole grew longer, wider, and soon it was deep enough to receive the body. Then the pallbearers approached. Wrapped in white fabric made from filaments of the fin mussel, the body was lowered into its watery grave. Captain Nemo, arms crossed over his chest, knelt in a posture of prayer, as did all of the friends of him who had loved them. My 2 companions and I bowed reverently. The grave was then covered over with the rubble dug from the seafloor and formed a low mound. When this was done, Captain Nemo and his men stood up. They all approached the grave, sank again on bended knee, and extended their hands in a sign of final farewell. Then the funeral party went back to the path of the Nautilus, returning beneath the arches of the forest, through the thickets, along the coral brushes, going steadily higher. Finally, the ship's rays appeared. Their luminous trail guided us to the Nautilus. One By 1 o'clock we had returned. After changing clothes, I climbed onto the platform, and in the grips of dreadfully obsessive thoughts, I sat next to the beacon. Captain Nemo rejoined me. I stood up and said to him, "So, as I predicted, that man died during the night." "Yes, Professor Arnox," Captain Nemo replied. "And now he rests beside his companions in this coral cemetery." "Yes, forgotten by the world, but not by us. We dig the graves, then crust the polyps with sealing away our dead for eternity." And this was a sudden gesture, and with a sudden gesture, the captain hid his face in his clenched fist, vainly trying to hold back a sob. Then he added, "There lies our peaceful cemetery, hundreds of feet buried beneath the surface of the waves. At least, Captain, your dead can sleep serenely there, out of the reach of sharks." "Yes, sir," Captain Nemo replied solemnly. "Of sharks and men." End of chapter. It was sweet but sad that they had a funeral. Oof, I agree. Part 2. Oh my gosh, it's restarting the chapter count. Coral graves, nice, yeah. Oof, I agree. Also, hello Jet, welcome to the stream. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you for the hydrate, stretch, and snack, Spyro. We're almost 2 hours into the stream. How's everyone doing? Outside of oof. I'm goodish. That's very fair, Jet. Enjoying the audiobook. Aw, yeah. Alright. I do believe it's time we continue on. To the best of our abilities. Part 2, Chapter 1. The Indian Ocean. Now we begin the second part of this voyage under the seas. The first ended in that moving scene at the Coral Cemetery, which left a profound impression on my mind. And so Captain Nemo would live out his life entirely in the heart of this immense sea, and even his grave lay ready in its impenetrable depths. There is the last sleep of the Nautilus occupants, friends bound together in death and in life, would be disturbed by no monster of the deep. No man either, the captain had added. We got 2 monsters and this guy didn't put the $1 off thing on it, but it's fine, and the worst part is it's like 5 for 4. Oh. Well, I hope things start looking up for you, Jet. So that's pretty much how my day was. Yeah. Always the same fierce, implacable defiance of human society. As for me, I was no longer content with the hypotheses that satisfied Council. That fine lad persisted on seeing the Nautilus commander as merely one of those unappreciated scientists who repay humanity's indifference with contempt. For Council, the captain was still a misunderstood genius who, tired of the world's deceptions, had been driven to take refuge in this inaccessible environment, where he was free to follow his instincts. But to my mind, this hypothesis explained only one side of Captain Nemo. In fact, the mystery of that last afternoon when we were locked in prison and put to sleep, the captain's violent precaution of snatching from my grasp a spyglass poised to scour the horizon, and the fatal wound given that man during some unexpected collision suffered by the Nautilus, all led me down a plain trail. No, Captain Nemo wasn't content simply to avoid humanity. His fearsome submersible served not only his quest for freedom, but also, perhaps, it was used in Lord knows what schemes of dreadful revenge. Right now, nothing is clear to me. I still glimpse only glimmers in the dark. I must limit my pen, as it were, to taking dictation from events. Pardon. But nothing binds us to Captain Nemo. He believes that escaping from the Nautilus is impossible. We are not even constrained by our word of honor. No promises fetter us. We're simply captives, prisoners masquerading under the name guests for the sake of everyday courtesy. Even so, Ned Land hasn't given up all hopes of recovering his freedom. He's sure to take advantage of the first chance that comes his way. No doubt I will do likewise, and yet I will feel some regret at making off with the Nautilus' secrets so generously unveiled to us by Captain Nemo. Because, ultimately, should we detest or admire this man, he was the persecutor or the persecuted. And in all honesty, before I leave him forever, I want to finish this underwater tour of the world, whose first stages had been so magnificent. I want to observe the full series of these wonders gathered under the seas of our globe. I want to see what no man has seen yet, even if I must pay for this insatiable curiosity with my life. What are my discoveries to date? Nothing, relatively speaking, since so far we've covered only 6,000 leagues across the Pacific. Nevertheless, I'm well aware that the Nautilus is drawing near to populated shores, and if some chance for salvation becomes available to us, it would be sheer cruelty to sacrifice my companions to my passion for the unknown. I must go with them, perhaps even guide them. But will this opportunity ever arise? The human being, robbed of his free will, craves such an opportunity, but the scientist, forever inquisitive, dreads it. That day, January 21st, 1868, the chief officer went at noon to take the sun's altitude. I climbed onto the platform, lit a cigar, and watched him from at work. It seemed obvious to me that this man didn't understand French, because I made several remarks in a loud voice that were bound to provoke him in some involuntary show of interest had he understood them. But he remained mute and motionless. While he took his sights with his sextant, one of the Nautilus sailors, a muscular man who had gone with us to Crespo Island during our first underwater excursion, came up to clean the glass panes of the beacon. I then examined the fittings of this mechanism, whose power was increased 100-fold by convex lenses that were designed like those in a lighthouse, and kept its rays productively focused. This electric lamp was so constructed as to yield its maximum illuminating power. In essence, this light was generated in a vacuum, ensuring both its steadiness and intensity. Such a vacuum also reduced wear on the graphite points between which the luminous arc expanded. This was an important savings for Captain Nemo, who couldn't easily renew them. But under these conditions, wear and tear were almost non-existent. When the Nautilus was ready to resume its underwater travels, I went below again to the lounge. The hatches closed once more and our course was set due west. We then plowed the waves of the Indian Ocean, vast liquid plains with an area of 550 million hectares, whose water was so transparent it makes you dizzy to lean over their surface. There, the Nautilus generally drifted at a depth between 100 and 200 meters. It behaved in this way for some days. To anyone without my grand passion for the sea, these hours would surely have seemed long and monotonous, but my daily strolls on the platform where I was revived by the life-giving ocean sea, the sights of the rich waters beyond the lounge windows, and books to be read in the library, and the compositions of my memoirs, took up all my time and left me without a moment of weariness or boredom. Is this the French fish book? It is!
Hi, Elliot. Welcome to the stream. I hope you're doing well today.
All in all, we enjoyed a highly satisfactory state of health. The diet on board agreed with us perfectly, and for my part, I could easily have gone without those changes of pace that Ned Land, in a spirit of protest, kept taxing his integrity to supply us. What's more, in this constant temperature, we didn't even have to worry about catching colds. Besides, the ship had a good stock of the Maldipore Deforphilia, also known province by the name sea fennel, and a poultice made from the dissolved flesh of its polyps. It will furnish an excellent cough medicine. Hi! For some days we saw a large number of aquatic birds with webbed feet, known as gulls or sea mews. Some were skillfully slain, and then when cooked in a certain fashion, they make a very acceptable platter of water game. Among the great wind riders carried over long distances from every shore and resting on the waves from their exhausting flights, I spotted some magnificent albatross, birds belonging to the long-winged family, whose discordant calls sound from the braying of an ass. The Taltiplames, fully webbed family, was represented by swift frigate birds, nimbly catching fish on the surface, and by numerous tropic birds of the genus Plankton. Among others, the red-tailed tropic bird, the size of a pigeon, its white plumage shaded with pink tints that contrasted with its dark-hued wings. The Nautilus's nets hauled up several types of sea turtle from the hawksbill genus with arching backs whose scales are highly prized. Diving easily, these reptiles can remain a good while underwater by closing the fleshy valves located at the external openings of their nasal passages. When they were captured, some hawkbills were still asleep inside their carapaces, a refuge from other marine animals. The flesh of these turtles was nothing memorable, but their eggs would make an excellent feast. As for fish, they always filled us with wonderment when, staring through the open panels, we could unveil the secrets of their aquatic lives. I noted several species I hadn't previously been able to observe. I'll mention chiefly some trunk fish unique to the Red Sea, the Sea of the East Indies, and that part of the ocean washing the coast of equinoctial America. Like turtles, armadillos, sea urchins, and crustaceans, these fish are protected by armor like plate that's neither chalky nor stony, but actual bone. Sometimes this armor takes the shape of a solid triangle, sometimes that of a solid quadrilateral. Among the triangle type, I noticed some half a decimeter long, with brown tails, yellow fins, and wholesome, exquisitely tasty flesh. I even recommend that they be acclimated to fresh water. A change, incidentally, that a number of saltwater fish can make with ease. I'll also mention some quadrilateral trunkfish topped by 4 large protuberances along the back. Trunkfish sprinkled with white spots on the underside of their body, which make good house pets like certain birds. Boxfish armed with stings formed by extensions of their bony crusts, whose odd grunting has earned them the nickname sea pigs. Then some trunkfish known as dromedaries with tough, leathery flesh and big coronial humps. From the daily notes kept by Mr. Council, I also retrieved certain fish from the genus Tetrodon unique to these seas. Southern puffers with red backs and white crests distinguished by 3 lengthwise rows of filaments, and jugfish 7 inches long, decked out in the brightest colors. Then, as specimens of other genera, blowfish resembling a dark brown egg, furrowed with white bands and lacking tails. Globefish, genuine porcupines of the sea, armed with stings and able to inflate themselves until they look like a pincushion bristling with needles. Seahorses common to every ocean, flying dragonfish with long snouts and highly descended pectoral fins shaped like wings, which enable them, if not to fly, at least to spring into the air. spatula-shaped paddlefish whose tails are covered with many scaly rings. Snipefish with long jaws, excellent animals 25 centimeters long and gleaming with the most cheerful looks. Bluish-gray dragonets with wrinkled heads, myriads of leaping blennies with dark stripes and long pectoral fins, gliding over the surface of the water with prestigious speed. Delicious sailfish that can hoist their fins in a favorable current like so many unfurled sails. Splendid nursery fish on which nature has lavished yellow azure, silver, and gold. Yellow mackerel with wings made of filament. Bullheads forever splattered with mud, which make distinct hissing sounds. Sea robins whose livers are thought to be poisonous. Ladyfish that can flutter with their eyelids. Finally, archerfish with long, tubular snouts. Real ocean-going flycatchers armed with a rifle unforeseen by either Remington or Caspot. It slays insects by shooting them with a simple drop of water. What is going on? I'm reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Hello, Lunaria. Welcome to the stream. I hope you're doing well today. Reading. Yes, reading. From the 89th fish genus in the Laceperidis system of classification, belonging to a second subclass of bony fish, characterized by gill covers and a bronchial membrane. I noted some scorpion fish whose heads are adorned with stings which have only one dorsal fin. These animals are covered with small scales or none at all, depending on the subgenus in which they belong. The second subgenus gave us some dactylus specimens, 3 to 4 decimeters long, streaked with yellow, their heads having a phantasmagoric appearance. As for the first subgenus, it furnished several specimens of that bizarre fish aptly nicknamed toadfish, whose big head is sometimes gorged with deep cavities, sometimes swollen with protuberance. Bristling with stings and strewn with nodules, it sports hideously irregular horns. Its body and tail are adorned with callocytes. Its stings can inflict dangerous injuries. It's repulsive and horrible. From January 21st to the 23rd, the Nautilus traveled at the rate of 250 leagues in 24 hours, hence 540 miles at the 22 mile per hour. If, during our trip, we were able to identify these various species of fish, it's because they were attracted by our electric light and tried to follow alongside, but most of them were outdistanced by our speed and soon fell behind. Temporarily, however, a few managed to keep pace with the Nautilus's waters. On the morning of the 24th, in latitude 12 degrees 55 south, and longitude 94 degrees 33, we were raised Keeling Island, a madreporic upheaving planted with magnificent coconut trees, which had been visited by Mr. Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. The Nautilus cruised along a short distance off the shore of this desert island. Our dragonets brought up many specimens of polyps and echinoderms, plus some unusual shells from the branch mollusca. Captain Nemo's treasures were enhanced by some valuable exhibits from the Delphiniola snail species, to which I joined some pointed coral star, a sort of parasitic foliary that often attaches itself to seashells. Soon Keeling Island appeared below the horizon, and our course was set to the northwest, towards the tip of the Indian Peninsula. Civilization! Ned Land told me that day. Much better than those Papuan Islands where we had ran into more savages than venison. On this Indian island, Professor, there are roads and high railways, English, French, and Hindu villages. We wouldn't go 5 miles without bumping into a fellow countryman. Come on now, isn't it time for our sudden departure from Captain Nemo? No, Ned, I replied in a very firm tone. Let's write it out, as you seafaring fellows say. The Nautilus is approaching populated areas. It's going back towards Europe. Let it take us there. After we arrive in home waters, we can go do as we see fit. Besides, I don't imagine Captain Nemo will let us go hunting on the coast of Malabar or Coromandel as he did in the forests of New Guinea. Well, sir, I can't imagine can't we manage without his permission? I didn't answer the Canadian. I wanted no argument. Deep down, I was determined to fully exploit the good fortune that had put me on board the Nautilus. After leaving Keeling Island, our pace got generally slower. It was also more unpredictable, often taking us to great depths. Several times we used our slanting fins, which internal levers could set to an oblique angle to our waterline. Thus we went as deep as 2 or 3 soundings of 13,000 meters, which have been unable to reach. As for the temperance of these lower strata, the thermometer always and invariably indicated 4 degrees centigrade. I merely observed that in the upper layers the water was always cooler even over shallow than in the open sea. On January 25th, the ocean being completely deserted, the Nautilus spent the day on the surface, turning the waves with its powerful propeller and making them spurt to great heights. Under these conditions, who wouldn't have mistaken it for a giant cetacean? I spent 3/4 of the day on the platform. I stared at the sea. Nothing on the horizon, except near 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a long steamer to the west, running on our opposite track. Its masting was visible for an instant, but it couldn't have seen the Nautilus because we were lying too low in the water. I imagined the steamboat belonged to the Peninsular and Oriental Line, which provides service from the islands of Ceylon to Sydney, also calling at King George Sound in Melbourne. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, just before the brief twilight that links day and night in the tropical zones, Council and I marveled at this unusual sight. It was a delightful animal whose discovery, according to the agents, is a sign of good luck. Aristotle, Athanasius, Pliny, and Oppian studied its habits and lavished on its behalf all the scientific poetry of Greece and Italy. They called it Nautilus in Pompulus, but modern science has not endorsed these designations, and this mollusk is now known as the name Argonaut. Anyone consulting Council would have learned from the gallant lad that the branch Mollusca is divided into 5 classes, that the first class features Cephalopodia, whose members are sometimes naked, sometimes covered with a shell, which consists of 2 families, Dibranchidia and the Tetrabranchidia, which are distinguished by their number of gills. That the family Dibranchidia include 3 genera: the argonaut, the squid, and the cuttlefish. If some recalcitrant listener confuses the argonaut, which is Astarbufilarius, in other words, a bearer of suction tubes, with the nautilus, which is Tentrafluarius, a bearer of tentacles, it will be simply unforgivable. Now, it was an ocean of argonauts then voyaging on the surface of the ocean. A school of argonauts, yes. We could count several hundreds of them. They belonged to that species of argonaut covered with protuberance and exclusively to the seas near India. These graceful mollusks were swimming backwards by means of their locomotive tubes, sucking water into these tubes and then expelling it. 6 of their 8 tentacles were long, thin, and floated on the water, while the other 2 were rounded into palms and spread into the wind like light sails. I could see perfectly their undulating spiral-shaped shells, which Cuvier aptly compared to an elegant cockle-boat. It's an actual boat indeed. It transports the animal that secretes it without the animal sticking to it. The argonaut is free to leave its shell, I told Council, but it never does. Not unlike Captain Nemo, Council replied sagely, which is why he should have christened his ship the Argonaut. From about an hour, the Nautilus cruised in the midst of this school of mollusks. Then, Lord knows why, they were gripped with a sudden fear, as if At a signal, every sail was abruptly lowered. Arms folded, bodies contracted, shells turned over by challenging their center of gravity, and the whole flotilla disappeared under the waves. It was instantaneous, and no squadron of ships ever maneuvered with greater togetherness. Just then, night fell suddenly, and the waves barely surged into the breeze, spreading placidly around the Nautilus's side plates. The next day, January 26, we cut the equator on the 82nd meridian, and we re-entered the northern hemisphere. During that day, a fearsome school of sharks provided us with an escort. Dreadful animals that teemed in these seas and made them extremely dangerous. There were Port Jackson sharks with a brown back and whitish belly, and 11 rows of teeth. Big-eye sharks with necks marked by a large black spot encircled in white and resembling an eye. And Isabella sharks whose rounded snouts were strewn with dark speckles. Often these powerful animals rushed at the lounge window with a violence less than comforting. At this point, Ned Land had lost all self-control. He wanted to rise to the surface of the waves and harpoon the monsters, especially certain smooth-mouthed sharks whose mouths were paved with teeth arranged like a mosaic, and some 5-meter tiger sharks that insisted on personally provoking him. But the Nautilus soon picked up speed and easily left astern the fastest of these man-eaters. On January 27th, at the entrance of the huge Bay of Bengal, we repeatedly encountered a gruesome sight. Human corpses floating on the surface of the waves. Carried by the Ganges of the high sea, they were deceased Indian villagers who hadn't been fully devoured by vultures, the only morticians in these parts. But there was no shortage of sharks assisting them with their undertaking chores. Near 7 o'clock in the evening, the Nautilus lay half-submerged, navigating in the midst of milky white waters. As far as the eye could see, the ocean seemed lassified. Was it an effect of the moon's rays? No, because the new moon was barely 2 days old and still lost below the horizon in sun's rays. The entire sky, although lit by the stellar radiation, seemed pitch black in comparison with the whiteness of these waters. Counsel couldn't believe his eyes, and he questioned me about the causes of this odd phenomenon. Luckily, I was in a position to answer him. That's called a milk sea, I told him. A vast expanse of white waves often seen along the coast of Ambonia and in these waterways. But, Counsel asked, could Master tell me the effects of the cause of this effect? Because I presume this water hasn't really changed into milk. No, my boy, and this whiteness that amazes you is merely due to the presence of myriads of tiny creatures called Infusioria, a sort of diminutive glowworm that's colorless and gelatinous in appearance, as thick as a strand of hair, and no longer than 1/5 of a millimeter. Some of these tiny creatures stick together over an area of several leagues. Several leagues! Counsel exclaimed. Yes, my boy, and don't even try to compute the number of these Infusioria. You won't pull it off, because, if I'm not mistaken, certain navigators have cruised through Milk Sea for more than 40 miles. I'm not sure that Counsel heeded my recommendation, because he seemed to be deep in thought, no doubt trying to calculate how many 1/5 of a millimeter are found in 40 square miles. As for me, I continued to observe this phenomenon. For several hours, the Nautilus spurs sliced through these whitish waves, and I watched it glide noiselessly over the soapy water, as if it were cruising through these foaming eddies at a bay's curtains, and counter-curtains sometimes leave between each other. Near midnight, the sea suddenly resumed its usual hue. Behind us all the way to the horizon, the skies kept mirroring the whiteness of those waves, and for a good while seemed imbued with the hazy glow of an aurora borealis. End of chapter. We're 51% of the way through 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. How is everyone doing? I have to say, there's a lot more death than I was expecting in this book. Like a lot. Alright. We're about 2.5 hours into the stream. How's everyone doing? I said already? I might have. Oh well. It happens. Alright. So, continuing onward. Part 2, Chapter 2. A new proposition from Captain Nemo. On January 28th, in latitude 9 degrees 4 north, when the Nautilus returned at noon to the surface of the sea, it lay in sight of land some 8 miles to the west. Right off, I observed a cluster of mountains about 2,000 feet high, whose shapes were very whimsically sculpted. After our position fixed, I re-entered the lounge, and when our bearings were reported on the chart, I saw that we were off the island of Ceylon, that pearl dangling from the lower lobe of the Indian peninsula. I was looking in the library for a book about this island, one of the most fertile in the world. Sure enough, I found a volume entitled Ceylon in the Shinglahese by H.C. Sir Exquisite Exquire. Re-entering the lounge, I first noted the bearings of Ceylon, on which antiquity lavished so many different names. It was located between latitude 5 degrees 55 and 9 degrees 49 north, and between longitude 79 degrees 42 and 82 degrees 4 east of the Mediterranean of Greenwich. Its length is 275 miles, its maximum width 150 miles, its circumference 900 miles, its surface area 24,448 square miles. In other words, little smaller than that of Ireland. Just then, Captain Nemo and his chief officer appeared. The captain glanced at the chart, then turning to me, "The island of Ceylon," he said, "is famous for its pearl fisheries. Would you be interested, Professor Arnox, in visiting one of those fisheries?" "Certainly, Captain." "Fine. It's easily done. Only when we see the fisheries, we'll see no fishermen. The annual harvest hasn't yet begun. No matter. I'll give orders to make for the Gulf of Manar, and we'll arrive there late tonight." The captain said a few words to his chief officer, who went out immediately. Soon the Nautilus re-entered its liquid element, and the pressure gauge indicated that it was staying at a depth of 30 feet. With the chart under my eyes, I looked for the Gulf of Manar. I found it on the 9th parallel of the northwestern shores of Ceylon. It was formed by a long curve of Little Manar Island. To reach it, we had to go all the way up to Ceylon's west coast. "Professor," Captain Nemo then told me, "there are pearl fisheries in the Bay of Bengal, the seas of the East Indies, and the seas of China and Japan, plus those seas south of the United States, the Gulf of Panama and the Gulf of California. But it's off Ceylon that such fishing reaps its richest rewards. No doubt we'll be arriving a little early. Fishermen gather in the Gulf of Manar only during the month of March, and for 30 days some 300 boats concentrate on the lucrative harvest of these treasures from the sea. Each boat is manned by 10 swordsmen and 10 fishermen. The latter divide into 2 groups, dive into rotation, and descend into the depths of 12 meters with the help of a heavy stone clutched between their feet and attached by a rope to their boat. "You mean," I said, "that such primitive methods are still all they use?" "All," Captain Nemo answered me. "Although these fisheries belong to the most industrialized people in the world, the English, to whom the Treaty of Amiens granted them in 1802. Yet it strikes me that diving suits like yours would perform yeoman service in such work. Yes, since these poor fishermen don't stay long underwater. On his voyage to Ceylon, the Englishman Percival made much of a Kaffir who stayed under 5 minutes without coming up to the surface, but I find that hard to believe. I know that some divers can last up to 77 seconds, and highly skilled ones to 87, but such men are rare, and when the poor fellows climb back on board, the water coming out their nose and ears is tinted with blood. I believe the average time underwater that these fishermen can tolerate is 30 seconds, during which they hastily stuff their little nets with all the pearl oysters they can tear loose. But these fishermen generally don't live to advanced age. Their vision weakens, ulcers break out on their eyes, sores from their bodies, and some are even stricken with apoplexy on the ocean floor. Yes, I said, it's a sad occupation and one that exists only to gratify the whims of fashion. But tell me, Captain, how many oysters can a boat fish up in a workday? About 40,000 to 50,000. It even said that in 1814, when the English government went fishing on its own behalf, its divers worked just 20 days and brought up 76 million oysters. At least, I asked, the fishermen are well paid, aren't they? Hardly, Professor. In Panama, they make just $1 per hour per week. In most places, they earn only a penny for each oyster that has a pearl, and they bring up so many oysters that have none. Only 1 penny to those poor people who make their employers rich. That's atrocious. On that note, Professor, Captain Nemo told me, you and your companions will visit them on our oyster bank, and if by chance some eager fisherman arrives early, well, we can watch him at work. That suits me, Captain. By the way, Professor Arnox, you aren't afraid of sharks, are you? Sharks? I exclaimed. This struck me as a pretty needless question, to say the least. Well, Captain Nemo went on, I admit, Captain, I'm not yet on familiar terms with that genus of fish. We're used to them, the rest of us, Captain Nemo answered, and in time you will be too. Anyhow, we'll be armed, and on our way we might hunt a man-eater or two. It's a fascinating sport. So, Professor, I'll see you tomorrow, bright and early. This said in a carefree tone, Captain Nemo left the lounge. If you're invited to hunt bears in the Swiss mountains, you might say, oh look, oh good, I get to go bear hunting tomorrow. If you're invited to hunt lions in the Atlas Plains or tigers in the jungles of India, you might say, ha! Now's my chance to hunt lions and tigers. But if you're invited to hunt sharks in their native element, you might want to think it over before accepting. As for me, I passed a hand over my brow, where beads of cold sweat were busy forming. Let's think this over, I said to myself, and let's take our time. Hunting otters in the underwater forest, as we did in the forests of Crespo Islands, is an acceptable activity. But to roam the bottom of the sea, where you're almost certain to meet man-eaters in the neighborhood, that's another story. I know that in certain countries, particularly in Andaman Islands, natives don't hesitate to attack sharks, daggers in one hand and noose in the other, but I also know that many who face these fearsome animals don't come back alive. Besides, I'm not a native, and even if I were a native in this instance, I don't think a little hesitation on my part would be out of the place. I am censoring a word with native. Don't worry about it. It's not like a slur or anything, I just don't want to say it. And there I was, fantasizing about sharks, envisioning huge jaws armed with multiple rows of teeth and capable of cutting a man in half. I could already feel a definite pain around my pelvic girdle, and now I resent that offhand manner in which the captain had extended his deplorable invitation. You would have thought it was an issue of going into the woods on some harmless fox hunt. Thank heavens, I said to myself. Council will never want to come along, and that'll be my excuse for not going with the captain. As for Ned Land, I admit I feel less competent in his wisdom. Danger, however great, held a perennial action for his aggressive nature. I went back to reading Sir's book, but I leafed through it mechanically. Between the lines, I kept seeing fearsome, wide open jaws. Just then, Council and the Canadian entered with a calm, even gleeful air. Little did they know what was waiting for them. "Ye gods, sir," Ned Land told me. "You're Captain Nemo, the devil take him. It's made us a very pleasant proposition." "Oh," I said. "You know about..." "With all due respect, Master," Council replied. "The Nautilus commander has invited us, together with Master, for a visit tomorrow to Ceylon's magnificent pearl fisheries. He did so on the most cordial terms and conducted himself like a true gentleman." "He didn't tell you anything else?" "Nothing, sir," the Canadian replied. "He said you'd already discussed this little stroll." "Indeed," I said, "but didn't he tell you any details on..." "Not a one, Mr. Naturalist. You will be going with us, right?" "Me? Why, yes, certainly, of course. I can see that you like the idea, Mr. Land." "Yes! It'll be a really unusual experience." "And possibly dangerous," I added in an insinuating tone. "Dangerous?" Ned Land replied. "A simple trip on an oyster bank?" Assuredly, Captain Nemo hadn't seen fit to plant the idea of sharks in the minds of my companions. For my part, I stared at them with an anxious eye as if they were already missing a limb or two. Should I alert them? Yes, surely, but I hardly know how to go about it. "Would Master," Council said to me, "give us some background on pearl fishing?" "On the fishing itself?" I asked. "Or the occupational hazard set?" "On the fishing," the Canadian replied. "Before we tackle the terrain, it helps to be familiar with it." "All right, sit down, my friends, and I'll teach you everything I myself have just been taught by the Englishman H.R., sir." Ned and Council took seats on the couch, and right off the Canadian said to me, "Sir, just what is a pearl exactly?" "My gallant Ned," I replied. "For poets, a pearl is a tear from the sea. For Orientals, it's a drop of solidified dew. For the ladies, it's a jewel that can wear on their fingers, necks, and ears that oblong its shape, glassy in luster and formed from mother of pearl. For chemists, it's a mixture of calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate with a little gelatin protein. And finally, for naturalists, it's a simple festering secretion from the organ that produces mother of pearl and certain valves." "Brent mollusca," Council said. "Class Acephala, ordered Tessia." "Correct, my scholarly Council. Now then, those Testacea capable of producing pearls include rainbow abalone, turbo snails, giant clams, and saltwater scallops. Really briefly, all of those that secrete mother of pearl, in other words, that blue, azure, violet, or white substance lining the inside of their valves." Are mussels included too?" the Canadian asked. "Yes, the mussels of certain streams in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Saxony, Bohemia, and France." "Good," the Canadian replied. "From now on, we'll pay closer attention to them." "But," I went on, "for secreting pearls, the ideal mollusk is the pearl oyster Meleagrina magnificifera, that valuable shellfish. Pearls result simply from mother of pearl solidifying into a globular shape. Either they stick to the oyster's shell or they become embedded in the creature's folds. On the valves, the pearl sticks fast, or on the flesh it lies loose. But its nucleus is always some small, hard object, say a sterile egg or a grain of sand, around which the mother of pearl is deposited in thin, concentric layers over several years of succession." "Can one find several pearls in the same oyster?" "Can one find several pearls in the same oyster?" Council asked. "Yes, my boy, there are some shellfish that turn into real jewel coffers. They even mention one oyster, about which I remain dubious, that supposedly contained at least 150 sharks." "150 sharks?" Ned Land yelped. Did I say sharks? I exclaimed hastily. I meant 550 pearls. Sharks wouldn't make sense. Indeed, Council said. But will Master tell us how one goes about extracting those pearls? One proceeds in several ways, and often when pearls stick to the valves, fishermen even pull them loose with pliers. But usually the shellfish is spread out on mats made from the esperitos grass that covers the beaches. Thus they die in the open air, and by the end of 10 days they've rotted sufficiently. Next they're immersed in a huge tank of salt water, then they're opened up and washed. At that point, the sorters begin their twofold task. First, they remove the layers of mother of pearl, which are known in the industry by the names legitimate silver, white, black, and these are shipped out in cases weighing 125 to 150 kilograms. Then they remove the oyster's meaty tissue, boil it, and finally strain it in order to extract even the smallest pearls. Do the prices of these pearls differ depending on their size? Council asked. Not only on their size, I replied, but also according to their shape, their water, in other words, their color, and their orient, in other words, that dappled, shimmering glow that makes them so delightful to the eye. The finest pearls are called virgin pearls, or paragons, that form in isolation within the mollusk's tissues. They're white, often opaque, but sometimes of opalescent transparency, and usually spherical or pear-shaped. The spherical ones are made into bracelets, the pear-shaped ones into earrings, and since they're the most valuable, they are priced individually. The other pearls that stick to the oyster shell are more erratically shaped and are priced by weight. Finally, classed in the lowest order, the smallest pearls are known by the name seed pearls. They're priced by the measuring cup and are used mainly in the creation of embroidery for church vestments. But it must be a long, hard job sorting out all these pearls by size, the Canadian said. No, my friend, that task is performed with 11 strainers or sieves that are pierced with different numbers of holes. These pearls staying in the strainers with 20 to 80 holes are in the first order. Those not slipping through the sieves pierced with 100 to 800 holes are in the second order. Finally, those pearls for which one strainer pierced with 900 to 1,000 holes make up the seed pearls. How ingenious, the council said, to produce dividing and classifying pearls to a mechanical operation. And could Master tell us the profits brought in by harvesting these banks of pearl oysters? According to Sir's book, I replied, these Ceylon fisheries are farmed annually for a total profit of 3 million mannies. Francs, Council rebuked. Yes, francs. 3 million francs, I went on. But I don't think these fisheries bring in the returns they once did. Similarly, the Central American fisheries used to make up an annual profit of 4 million francs during the reign of King Charles V, but now they bring in only 2/3 of that amount. All in all, it's estimated that 9 million francs is the current yearly return for the whole pearl harvesting industry. But, Council replied, haven't certain famous pearls been quoted at extremely high prices? Yes, my boy. They say Julius Caesar gave Servilia a pearl worth 120,000 francs in our currency. Euros. I've even heard stories, the Canadian said, about some lady in ancient times who drank pearls and vinegar. Cleopatra. Council shot back. It must have tasted pretty bad, Ned Land added. Abominable, Ned, my friend, Council replied. But when a little glass of vinegar is worth 1,500,000 francs, its taste is a small price to pay. I'm sorry I didn't marry the gal, the Canadian said, throwing up his hands with an air of disencouragement. Ned Land married to Cleopatra? Council exclaimed. But I was all set to tie the knot, Council, the Canadian replied in all seriousness. It wasn't my fault the whole business fell through. I even bought a pearl necklace for my fiancée, Kate Tender. She married somebody else instead. Well, that necklace cost me only $1.50. But you can absolutely trust me on this, Professor. Its pearls were so big they wouldn't have gone through that strainer with 20 holes. Good night, Athena. Good night, anime fanatic. Sleep well. My gallant Ned, I replied, laughing. Those were artificial pearls. Ordinary glass beads whose insides were coated with the essence of Orient. Wow, the Canadian replied. That essence of Orient must sell for quite a large sum. As little as €0. It comes from the scales of a European carp. It's nothing more than a silver substance that collects in the water and preserved in an obnomnia. It's worthless. Maybe that's why Kate Tender married somebody else, replied Mr. Land philosophically. But, I said, getting back to the pearls of great value, I don't think any sovereign ever possessed one superior to the pearl owned by Captain Nemo. This one? Counsel said, pointing to a magnificent jewel in its glass case. Exactly. I'm certainly not far off when I measure its value at 2 million, francs, Counsel said quickly. Yes, I said. 2 million francs, and no doubt all it cost our captain was the effort of picking it up. Ha! Ned Land exclaimed. During our stroll tomorrow, who says we won't run into one just like it? Ah, Counsel put in. And why not? What good would a pearl worth millions do here on the Nautilus? Here, no, Ned Land said. But elsewhere... Oh, elsewhere, Counsel put in, shaking his head. In fact, I said, Mr. Land is right. If we ever brought back to Europe or America a pearl worth millions, it would make the story of our adventures more authentic and much more rewarding. That's how I see it, the Canadian said. But, said Counsel, who perpetually returned to the dietetic side of things, is this pearl fishing ever dangerous? No, I replied quickly, especially if one takes certain precautions. What risk would you run a job like that? Midland said, swallowing a few gulps of salt water. Whatever you say, Ned. Then, trying to intimidate Captain Nemo's carefree tone, I asked, By the way, gallant Ned, are you afraid of sharks? Me, the Canadian replied. I'm a professional harpooner. It's my job to make a mockery of them. It isn't an issue, I said, of fishing for them with a swivel hook, hoisting them onto a deck of a ship and chopping off the tail in the sweep of an axe, opening the belly, ripping out the heart, and tossing it out into the sea. So it's an issue of... Yes, precisely. In the water? In the water. Ye gods, give me a good harpoon! You see, sir, these sharks are badly designed. They have to roll their bellies over to snap you, and in the meantime... Ned Land had a way of pronouncing the word snap that sent chills down my spine. Well, how about you, Counsel? What are your feelings about these man-eaters? Me, Counsel said. I'm afraid I must be frank with Master. Good for him, I thought. If Master faces these sharks, Counsel said, I think his loyal servant should face them with him. End of chapter. Oh boy. Professor Arnox is getting in a bit over his head, I think. We are almost 3 hours into the stream. How is everyone doing? I think, I might end up calling this stream pretty quick though, because my voice is starting to get tired. But that's okay. Enjoying the reading. Aw, yeah. Thank you for the hydrate. Like, let's do one chapter and then we'll see how I'm feeling. Then we'll decide if I'm gonna end the stream or not. How about that? Well, I'm going to end it, it's just when. This is not the everlasting stream, I promise. Alright. Part 2, Chapter 3. A Pearl Worth 10 Million. Night fell. I went to bed. I slept pretty poorly. Man-eaters played a major role in my dreams, and I found it more or less appropriate that the French word for shark, requin, has its linguistic roots in the word requiem. The next day at 4 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by the steward whom Captain Nemo had placed expressly at my service. I got up quickly, dressed, and went into the lounge. Captain Nemo was waiting for me. "Professor Arnox," he said to me, "are you ready to start?" "I'm ready." "Kindly follow me." "What about my companions, Captain?" "They've been alerted and are waiting for us." "Aren't we going to put on our diving suits?" I asked. "Not yet. I haven't let the Nautilus pull too near to the coast, and we're fairly well out from the Manar oyster bank. I have the skiff ready, and it will take us to the exact spot where we'll disembark, which will save us a pretty long trek. It's carrying our diving equipment, and we'll suit up just before we begin our underwater exploring." Captain Nemo took me to the central companionway, whose steps led to the platform. Ned and Council were there, enraptured with the pleasure trip getting underway. Oars in position, 5 of the Nautilus sailors were waiting for us aboard the skiff, which was moored alongside. The night was still dark. Layers of clouds cloaked the sky and left only a few stars in my view. My eyes flew to the side where the land lay, but I saw only a blurred line covering 3/4 of the horizon from the southwest to the northeast. Going up Seon's west coast during the night, the Nautilus lay west of the bay, or rather that gulf formed by the mainland and Manar Island. Under these dark waters there stretched the bank of shellfish, an inexhaustible field of pearls more than 20 miles long. Captain Nemo, Council, Ned Land, and I found seats on the stern of the skiff. The longboat's coxswain took the tiller. His 4 companions leaned into their oars. The moorings were cast off and we pulled clear. The skiff headed southward. The oarsmen took their time. I watched their strokes vigorously catch the water, and they always waited 10 seconds before rowing again, following the practice used in those navies. While the longboat coasted, drops of liquid flicked from the oars and hit the dark trudges of the water, pitter-pattering like splashes of molten lead. Coming from well out, a mild swell made the skiff roll gently, and a few cresting billows lapped at its bow. We were silent. What was Captain Nemo thinking? Perhaps that his approaching shore was too close for comfort, contrary to the Canadian's view in which it still seemed too far away. As for Council, he had come along out of simple curiosity. Near 5:30, the first glimmers of light on the horizon defined the upper lines of the coast with greater distinctness. Fairly flat on the east, it swelled a little towards the south. 5 miles still separated it from us, and its beach merged with the misty waters. Between us and the shore, the sea was deserted. Not a boat, not a diver. Profound solitude reigned over this gathering place of pearl fishermen. As Captain Nemo had commented, we were arriving in these waterways a month too soon. At 6 o'clock the day broke suddenly, with that speed unique to tropical regions, which experience no real dawn or dusk. The sun's rays pierced the clouds curtain gathered on the easterly horizon, and the radiant orb rose swiftly. I could clearly see the shore, which featured a few sparse trees here and there. The skiff advanced towards Manar Island, which curved to the south. Captain Nemo stood up from his thwart and studied the sea. At his signal, the anchor was lowered, but its chain barely ran because the bottom lay no more than a meter down, and this locality was one of the shallowest spots near the bank of the shellfish. Instantly, the skiff wheeled around under the ebb tide's outbound thrust. "Here we are, Professor Arnox," Captain Nemo then said. "You observed this confined bay. A month from now, in this very place, the numerous fishing boats of harvesters will gather, and these are the waters that our divers will ransack so daringly. This bay is so facetiously laid out for their type of fishing. It's sheltered from the strongest winds, and the sea is never very turbulent here. Highly favorable conditions for diving work. Now let's put on our underwater suits and we'll begin our stroll." I didn't reply, and while staring at these suspicious waves, I began to put on my heavy aquatic clothes, helped by the longboat sailors. Captain Nemo and my 2 companions suited up as well. None of the Nautilus's men were to go with us on this new excursion. Soon we were imprisoned up to the neck in India rubber, clothing and straps fastened on the air devices onto our backs. As for the rum cough device, it didn't seem to be in the picture. Before inserting my head into its copper capsule, I commented on this to the captain. "Our lighting equipment would be useful to us," the captain answered me. "We won't be going very deep, and the sun's rays will be sufficient to light our way. Besides, it's unwise to carry electric lanterns under these waves. The brightness might unexpectedly attract certain dangerous occupants of these waterways." As Captain Nemo pronounced these words, I turned to Counsel and Ned Land, but my 2 friends had already encased their craniums in their metal headgear, and they could neither hear nor reply. I had one question less to address to the captain. "What about our weapons?" I asked him. "Our rifles." "Rifles? What for? Don't your mountaineers attack bears dagger in hand? It isn't steel sure than lead. Here's a sturdy blade. Slip it under your belt and let's be off." I stared at my companions. They were armed in the same fashion, and Ned Land also banishing an enormous harpoon he had stowed in the skiff before leaving the Nautilus. Then, following the captain's example, I led myself to be crowned with my heavy copper spear, and our air tanks immediately went into action. An instant later, the longboat sailors helped us overboard one after the other, and we set foot on level sand in 1.5 meters of water. Captain Nemo gave us a hand signal. We followed him a gentle slope and disappeared under the waves. There, the obsessive fears in my brain left me. I became surprisingly calm again. The ease with which I could move increased my confidence, and the many strange sights captivated my imagination. The sun was already sending sufficient light under the waves. The tiniest objects remained visible. After 10 minutes of walking, we were in 5 meters of the water, and the terrain had become almost flat. Like a convey of snipe over a marsh, there rose underfoot schools of unusual fish from the genus Monoperturus, whose members have no fin but their tail. I recognized the Javanese eel, a genuine 8-decimeter serpent in a bluish-gray belly, which, without the gold lines over its flanks, could easily be confused with the conger eel. From the butterfish genus, whose oval body are very flat, I observed several adorned in brilliant colors and sporting a dorsal fin like a sickle. Edible fish that, when dried and marinated, make an excellent dish known by the name karawadi. Then, some sea poachers, fish belonging to the genus Aspidophoros, whose bodies are covered with scaly armor divided into eight lengthwise sections. Meanwhile, as the sun got progressively higher, it lit up the watery mass more and more. The sea floor changed little by little. Its fine-grained sand was followed by a genuine causeway of smooth crags covered by a carpet of mollusks and zoophytes. Among other specimens in these 2 branches, I noted some window-pane oysters with thin valves of unequal size, a type of orchidoid unique to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. These orange-hued Lucian with circular shells, owl-shaped agar shells, some of those Persian morex snails that supply the Nautilus with such wonderful dye, silky periwinkles, 15 centimeters long that rose under the waves like hands ready to grab you. Turban snails with shells made of horn and bristling all over with spines. Lamp shells, edible duck clams that feed the Hindu marketplace. Subtly luminous jellyfish of the species Pelagia panophyra. And finally some wonderful Lucian fabelliforma, magnificent sea fans that fashion one of the most luxurious tree forms in this ocean. Thank you for the hydrate, Tofu. Welcome to the stream. I hope you're doing well today. Hi. In the midst of this moving vegetation, under arbors of water plants, there raced legions of clumsy articulates, in particular some fanged frog crabs whose carapaces form a slightly rounded triangle, robber crabs exclusive to these waterways, and horrible paranthrope crabs whose appearance was repulsive to the eye. One animal, no less hideous, which I encountered several times, was the enormous crab that Mr. Darwin observed, to which nature had given the distinct and requisite strength to eat coconuts. It scrambles up trees on the beach and sends the coconuts tumbling. They fracture it in their fall and are opened by its powerful pincers. Here, under their clear waves, this crab raced around with matchless agility, while green turtles from the species frequenting the Malabar coast moved sluggishly along the crumbling rocks. Near 7 o'clock, we finally surveyed the bank of shellfish, where pearl oysters reproduced by the millions. These valuable mollusks stick to rocks where they're strongly attached by a mass of brown filaments that forbids their moving about. In this respect, oysters are inferior even to mussels, to whom nature had not denied all talent for locomotion. The shellfish Melegirina, that womb for pearls whose valves are nearly equal in size, has the shape of a round shell with thick walls and a very rough exterior. Some of these shells were furrowed with flaky greenish bands that radiate down from the top. These were the young oysters. The others had rugged black surfaces measured up to 15 centimeters in width and were 10 or more years old. Captain Nemo pointed to the prestigious heap of shellfish, and I saw that these mines were genuinely inexhaustible, since nature's creative powers were greater than man's destructive instincts. True to those instincts, Ned Land greedily stuffed the finest of these mollusks into a net he carried at his side. But we couldn't stop. We had to follow the captain, who headed down trails seemingly known only to himself. The seafloor rose noticeably, and when I lifted my arms, sometimes they would pass above the surface of the sea. Then the level of the oyster bank would lower unpredictably. Often we went around tall, pointed rocks hissing like pyramids. In their dark crevices, huge crustaceans, aiming their long legs like heavy artillery, watched us with unblinking eyes, while underfoot there cut millipedes, bloodworms, aricia worms, and annelid worms, whose antennas and tubular tentacles were incredibly long. Just then, a huge cave opened up in our path, hollowed from a picturesque pile of rocks whose smooth heights were completely hung with underwater flora. At first, these caves looked pitch black to me. Inside, the sun's rays seemed to diminish by degrees. Their hazy transparency was nothing more than drowned light. Captain Nemo went in. We followed him. My eyes soon grew accustomed to this comparative gloom. I distinguished the unpredictably contoured springings of a vault, supported by natural pillars firmly based on a granite foundation, like the weighty columns of Tuscan architecture. Why had our incomprehensible guide taken us to the depths of this underwater crypt? I would soon find out. After going down After going down a fairly steep slope, our feet trod the floor of a sort of circular pit. There, Captain Nemo stopped, and his hand indicated an object that I hadn't yet noticed. It was an oyster of an extraordinary dimension, a titanic giant clam, a holy water font that could have held a whole lake, a basin more than 2 meters wide, hence even bigger than the one adorning the Nautilus's lounge. I approached this phenomenal mollusk. Its mask of filaments attached it to a table of granite, and there it grew by itself in the midst of the cave's calm waters. I estimated that the weight of this giant clam at 300 kilograms. Hence such an oyster held 15 kilos of meat, and you'd need the stomach of King Gargantua to eat a couple dozen. Captain Nemo was obviously familiar with this bivalve's existence. This wasn't the first time he'd paid it a visit. I thought his sole reason for leading us to this locality was to show us a natural curiosity. I was mistaken. Captain Nemo had an explicit personal interest in checking on the current condition of this giant clam. The mollusk's 2 valves were partially open. The captain approached and stuck his dagger vertically between the shell to discourage any ideas about closing. Then, with his hand, he raised the fringed, membrane-filled tunic that made up the animal's mantle. There, between its leaf-like folds, I saw a loose pearl as big as a coconut. Its globular shape, perfect clarity, and wonderful orient made it a jewel of incalculable value. Carried away by curiosity, I stretched out my hand to take it, fondle it, but the captain stopped me, signaled no, removed his dagger in one swift motion, and let the 2 valves snap shut. I then understood Captain Nemo's intent. By leaving the pearl buried beneath its giant clam's mantle, he allowed it to grow imperceptibly. With each passing year, the mollusk's secretions added a new concentric layers. The captain alone was familiar with the cave where this wonderful fruit of nature was ripening, and alone reared it, so to speak, in order to transfer it to one day his dearly beloved museum. Perhaps following the example of oyster farmers in China and India, he had even predetermined the creation of this pearl by sticking under the mollusk's folds some piece of glass or metal that was gradually covered with mother of pearl. In any case, comparing this pearl to others I already knew about, and to those shimmering in the captain's collection, I estimated that it would be worth at least 10 million francs. It was a superb natural curiosity rather than a luxurious piece of jewelry, because I don't know of any female ear that could handle it. Our visit to this opulent giant clam came to an end. Captain Nemo left the cave, and we climbed back to the bank of shellfish in the midst of these clear waters not yet disturbed by divers at work. We walked by ourselves, genuine loiterers, stopping or straying as our fancies dictated. For my part, I was no longer worried about those dangers my imagination had so ridiculously exaggerated. The shallows drew noticeably closer to the surface of the sea, and soon, walking in only a meter of water, my head passed well above the level of the ocean. Council rejoined me, and glowing his huge copper castle to mine, his eyes gave me a friendly greeting. But this lofty plateau measured only a few fathoms, and soon we re-entered our element. I think I've now earned the right to dub it that. 10 minutes later, Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. I thought he'd called a halt so that we could turn and start back. No. With a gesture, he ordered us to crouch beside him at the foot of a wide crevice. His hand motioned towards a stop within the liquid mass, and I looked carefully. 5 meters away, a shadow appeared and dropped to the ocean floor. The alarming idea of sharks crossed my mind, but I was mistaken. And once again, we didn't have to deal with with monsters of the deep. It was a man, a living man, an Indian fisherman, a poor devil who no doubt had come to gather what he could before harvest time. I saw the bottom of his dinghy moored a few feet above his head. He could dive and go back up in quick succession. A stone cut in the shape of a sugar loaf, which he gripped between his feet with while a rope connected to his boat served to lower him more quickly to the ocean floor. This was the extent of his equipment. Arriving on the seafloor at a depth of about 5 meters, he fell to his knees and stuffed his sack with shellfish gathered at random. Then he went back up, emptied his sack, pulled up his stone, and started all over again, the whole process lasting only 30 seconds. This diver didn't see us. A shadow cast by our crag hid us from his view. And besides, how could this poor Indian ever have guessed that human beings, creatures like himself, were near him under the water, eavesdropping on his movements, not missing a single detail of his fishing? So he went up and down several times. He gathered only about 10 shellfish per dive, because he had to tear them from the banks where they each clung with its toughness mass of filaments. And how many of these oysters for which he risked his life would have no pearl in them? I observed him with great care. His movements were systematically executed, and for half an hour no danger seemed to threaten him. So I had gotten used to the sight of this fascinating fisherman when all at once, just as the Indian was kneeling on the floor, I saw him make a frightened gesture, stand, and gather himself to spring back to the surface of the waves. I understood his fear. A gigantic shadow appeared above the poor diver. It was a shark of huge size, moving in diagonally, eyes ablaze, jaw open wide. I was speechless with horror, unable to make a single movement. With one vigorous stroke of its fins, the ferocious animal shot towards the Indian, who slumped aside and avoided the shark's bite, but not the thrashing of its tail, because that tail struck him across the chest and stretched him out on the seafloor. The scene lasted barely a few seconds. The shark turned, roiled on its back, and was getting ready to cut the Indian in half, when Captain Nemo, who was stationed beside me, suddenly shot up. Then he strode right towards the monster, dagger in hand, ready to fight it at close quarters. Just as it was about to snap up the poor fisherman, the man-eater saw its new adversary, repositioned itself on its belly, and headed swiftly towards him. I can see Captain Nemo's bearings to this day. Bracing himself, he waited for this fearsome man-eater with wonderful composure, and when the latter rushed at him, the captain leaped aside with prodigious quickness, avoided a collision, and sank his dagger into its belly. But that wasn't the end of the story. A dreadful battle was joined. The shark bellowed, so to speak. Blood was pouring into the waves from its wounds. The sea was dyed red, and through this opaque liquid, I could see nothing else. Nothing else until the moment when, through a rift in the clouds, I saw the daring captain clinging to one of the animal's fins, fighting the monster at close quarters, belaboring his enemy's belly with stabs of the dagger, yet unable to deliver the deciding thrust. In other words, a direct hit to the heart. In its struggles, the man-eater churned the watery mass so furiously that eddies threatened to knock me over. I wanted to run to the captain's rescue, but I was transfixed with horror, unable to move. I stared wide-eyed. I saw the fight enter a new phase. The captain fell to the seafloor, toppled by the enormous mass weighing him down, and the shark's jaws opened astoundingly wide, like a pair of industrial shears, and that would have been the finish of Captain Nemo had not Ned Land, quick as thought, rushed forward with his harpoon and driven its dreadful point into the shark's underside. The waves were saturated with masses of blood. The water shook with the movements of the man-eater, which thrashed about with indescribable fury. Ned Land hadn't missed his target. This was the monster's death rattle. Pierced to the heart, it was struggling with dreadful spasm after aftershock knocked Council off his feet. Meanwhile, Ned Land pulled the captain clear. Uninjured, the latter stood up, went right to the Indian, quickly cut the rope binding the man to a stone, took the fellow in his arms, and with vigorous kick of his heel rose to the surface of the sea. The three of us followed him, and a few moments later, miraculously safe, we reached the fisherman's longboat. Captain Nemo's first concern was to revive this unfortunate man. I wasn't sure he would succeed. I hoped so, since the poor devil hadn't been under very long, but that stroke found the shark's tail would have been his death blow. Fortunately, after vigorously massaging by Council and the captain, I saw the nearly drowned man regain consciousness little by little. He opened his eyes. How startled he must have felt, how frightened even, at seeing 4 huge copper craniums leaning over him. And after all, and above all, he must have thought when Captain Nemo pulled a bag of pearls from a pocket in his diving suit and placed it in the fisherman's hands. This magnificent benefaction from the man of waters to the poor Indian from Ceylon was accepted by the latter with trembling hands. His bewildered eyes indicated he didn't know what superhuman creatures he owed his life to and his fortune. At the captain's signal, we returned to the banks of shellfish and retraced our steps. We walked for half an hour until we encountered the anchor connecting the seafloor with the Nautilus skiff. Back on board, the sailors helped us divest us of our heavy copper carapaces. Captain Nemo's first words were spoken to the Canadian. "Thank you, Mr. Land," he said to him. "Tit for tat, Captain," Ned Land replied. "I owed it to you." The ghost of a smile glided across the captain's lips, and that was all. "To the Nautilus," he said. The longboat flew over the waves. A few minutes later, we encountered the shark's corpse again, floating. From the black markings on the tips of its fins, I recognized the dreadful squalus melanoperophis from the fins in the seas of the East Indies, a variety of the species of sharks proper. It was more than 25 feet long, its enormous mouth occupying a third of its body. It was an adult, as could be seen from the 6 rows of teeth coming from isosceles triangles in its upper jaw. Council looked at it with purely scientific fascination, and I'm sure he placed it, not without good reason, in the class of cardiologenic fish, order Chondorchirurgia, with fixed gills, families Cephalia, genus Squaleus. While I was contemplating this inert mass, suddenly a dozen of these ferocious Metaloptera appeared around our longboat, but paying no mind to us, they pounced on the corpse and quarreled over every scrap of it. By 8:30, we were back on board the Nautilus. There, I fell into thinking about the incidents that marked our excursion over the Monaro oyster bank. 2 impressions inevitably stood out. One concerned Captain Nemo's matchless bravery, the other his devotion to a human being, a representative of that race from which he had fled beneath the seas. In spite of everything, this strange man hadn't yet succeeded in stifling his heart. When I shared these impressions with him, he answered me in a tone touched with emotion. "That Indian, Professor, lived in the land of the oppressed, and I am to this day, and will be until my last breath, a native of that same land." End of chapter. So Captain Nemo's from India. Cool. I think, maybe. That's what I'm getting. I'm gonna have to go ahead and end the stream, I think. Poor Sharky. Yeah. Poor Sharky. Tried to get a nibble. Definitely got stabbed a lot. Chad Nemo. Yeah. Got stabbed a lot. He hungry, and he got stabbied. Like a lot. Like maybe a little overkill there, Captain Nemo. Alright. I need to go ahead and end this stream to rest my voice. It's starting to get a bit sore. But thank you all so much for coming and spending time with me today and enjoying the story. Shark steaks for everyone, or at least the other sharks. Thank you for the hydrate. You get that good rest, lovely Athena. Thank you, Pony. Now, unless anyone has a request, I think I'm going to go ahead and raid Buka. Buka's very neat and looks like she's working on drawing. Alright. Buka, yes! Buka-chan. Yes. That's the right username, right? Yes. Alright. Thank you again, everyone who came to the stream. I really appreciate you being here. And if you enjoyed and haven't already, do feel free to follow or subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. And I will see you all next time. Bye-bye!